Welcome back, guys. Today we're heading into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where beauty and terror walk side by side. These ancient ridges are wrapped in mist, their valleys echoing with stories that have haunted generations. Locals whisper about voices calling from the woods, shadowy figures watching from the tree line, and travelers who vanished without a trace on lonely mountain trails. The deeper you go, the more you realize that something in these mountains doesn't want to be disturbed. These aren't legends made up for thrill, they're chilling. It's true accounts of people who faced the unexplainable in one of the most mysterious regions of America. So sit back, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for 20 true, creepy, and scary Appalachian Mountains horror stories that will leave you looking over your shoulder tonight. It was late September of last year, the kind of evening when the air feels heavy with a damp chill and the light fades faster than you expect. I was working as part of a two-man survey crew for the county. It's cutting line through a dense rhododendron thicket in the southern Appalachians. If you've never been in one of those laurel hells, as the old-timers call them, you can't really understand what the word impenetrable means. Its branches knit together so tight you have to fight for every step, and even when you manage to squeeze through, you come out scratched, bleeding, and with your shirt half torn off. It was hard work, but it paid decent, and the woods were familiar to me. Or at least they had been. My partner that day was Ray. He was older, late 40s. The kind of guy who could smoke half a pack while swinging a machete and never miss a beat. We'd been at it since early morning, hacking our way up a ridge, flagging line for a future road survey. By late afternoon, the sky had gone gray, and a steady mist was starting to drift in, clinging to the leaves. We were tired, soaked, and covered in the sweet, resinous stink of laurel sap. The thicket was so dense we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. To keep track of each other, we'd whistle one short note, wait, then the other would answer back. It was simple, and it worked. I'd cut forward a few yards, give a whistle, hear Ray answer, then he'd push forward on his side. We were maybe 30 feet apart, completely out of sight, but keeping in rhythm. Around 5 p.m., I whistled and got an answer. Only it wasn't Ray's. Ray had a high, clear note, almost cheerful, like a bird call. This reply came low and sharp, like someone forcing air through their teeth. At first, I thought maybe it was just the acoustics, the laurel bouncing the sound around. I called out, "That you, Ray?" Nothing. A minute later, Ray whistled from behind me, the usual bright note. He was a good 50 yards back, working a slower patch of brush. That's when my stomach dropped. Whatever had answered me wasn't him, and it had been closer, much closer. I told myself it had to be an echo. The laurel was thick enough to play tricks. But as I moved forward, whistling again, I got the same reply, sharp and flat, from somewhere ahead. I couldn't see more than a tangle of wet leaves and gray mist, but it was there. Ray caught up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thought I heard you whistling offline," he said. I told him what I'd heard. He just shook his head. "Fox, maybe." Sometimes they scream. Sounds like all sorts of things. But he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, but every time I whistled, I'd get that same reply, always ahead of me, always just out of reach. Ray heard it too, though he didn't say much. He just kept his machete swinging harder, like the noise made him angry. Then came the part I can't explain. We broke into a tiny clearing, barely more than a gap, where the thicket thinned for a few yards. The ground was damp and mossy, with a half-rotted log lying across it. I stopped, whistled, and this time the answer came not from ahead, but from the log itself. Low, sharp, echoing right at our feet. Ray froze. His eyes locked on mine, wide and pale. "That wasn't no fox," he muttered. I knelt, half expecting to see some animal crawl out from under the log. But there was nothing, just wet moss, dark soil, and the sickly, sweet smell of decay. Yet the sound had been there. I swear it, like something crouched in a space too tight for a body, mocking me with my own signal. We didn't talk after that. We just kept moving, cutting fast, both of us whistling less and less. The woods felt heavier, the mist pressing down until the daylight was almost gone. At some point, we realized we were no longer getting replies. At all, just silence, broken by the scrape of machetes and our own ragged breathing. We made it back to the truck just before dark, mud up to our knees and nerves shot. Ray lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Don't whistle in those thickets again," he said finally. "Not unless you want something to answer." I laughed. It off at the time told myself it was exhaustion and nerves. But here's the thing. A week later, another crew went out to the same ridge. They came back early, pale as ghosts, swearing they'd heard voices in the laurel. Not words, just whistles, low and sharp, coming from places no person could have stood. I've worked plenty of rough terrain since then, but I won't go back to that ridge, not through the laurel. And I sure as hell won't use a whistle too. Keep track of anyone, 'cause I'm not sure what's out there listening, or how close it might already be. And sometimes, when the house is quiet at night, I'll catch myself hearing it again low, sharp, forcing air through teeth, answering me from the dark corners of a place no human should fit. It was Friday, October 21st, 2022. The kind of date that stamps itself into your head without asking permission. I had been circling it on the calendar for weeks, because it was the first weekend in years where I had no work, no obligations, no kids to shuttle, nobody waiting for me at home. It was just me, a battered old rifle, a cooler of groceries, and the woods. I chose Greenbrier County, West Virginia, because it's far enough away that nobody drives out there without a reason, and because Cold Knob had been a name passed around in the hunting forums as one of those ridges where you can go days without running into another person. To me, that was a promise more than a warning. I wanted the quiet. The drive out was gray and sullen. The dashboard thermometer read 52 degrees when I left town. But the higher I climbed into the mountains, the lower it dropped, the gravel. On the old forest road sang under my tires, a pinging that echoed off the spruce trunks. I pulled over at a narrow cut in the trees, the sort of place where the rangers set a gate to keep out vehicles. I slammed the truck door and instantly regretted the sound. It felt wrong, too loud in that stillness. The air smelled like wet rock and pine needles, metallic and sharp. I slung my pack over my shoulders, the weight familiar in a way that made me almost sentimental. My dad had taken me hunting once up here when I was a kid, years before he died. And I remember him saying, "The mountain has a memory longer than ours." At the time, I didn't understand it. On that night, I started to. The hike wasn't long. Maybe 40 minutes uphill through rhododendron and laurel, the trail a soft quilt of needles and moss. The silence pressed close. When the trail widened, I could hear a creek running far below, a liquid hiss muffled by distance. Ravens heckled each other across the canopy, and once I saw a woodpecker dart like a white flash between trunks. The woods smelled alive in the way that only damp Appalachian ridges can dot. I reached a small shelf and set camp there. The sun was falling fast behind the ridge, painting the sky in strips of dull pink and heavy blue. My tent went up with practiced motions, stakes driven deep into the spongy earth, sleeping bag unrolled, pad beneath. I gathered stones and built a ring for a fire, then set it glowing with dry twigs and split spruce. The smoke smelled like home and memory, like a younger version of myself when life wasn't always crowded with responsibility. I ate instant noodles from a metal cup, drank half a beer, and watched the fire eat down into the stone circle. Around me, the woods grew darker until only the flames mattered. The temperature slipped with the light. My fingers ached when I stretched them away from the heat. The ridge was silent, except for the pop of resin in the wood. That was when I saw it, a light blue dot. At first, I thought it was a hunter with a headlamp, but it wasn't shaped like a beam. It was rounded, soft-edged, pulsing faintly as if breathing. It hovered up the slope maybe 200 yards away, too high to be someone standing, too steady to be a trick of my eyes. I stared until my noodle cup went cold. The light hung there, then drifted uphill, slow and deliberate. I should have let it go. I should have stayed by the fire and ignored it. But curiosity is a cruel thing. I shrugged on my jacket, slung my rifle, and started after it. The fire's glow dropped away behind me, leaving me in the grip of colder air, my breath fogging in the beam of my small flashlight. The blue lantern bobbed ahead of me, never closer, never farther, always just out of reach. Every time I thought I was catching up, it lifted a little, sliding between trees like it wanted me to follow. After 20 minutes of climbing, I broke into a clearing. The lantern had vanished, but what I found made my stomach not dot a camp for canvas tents arranged in a loose circle around a dead fire pit. Old-fashioned, heavy canvas, not the nylon kind. Each was zipped, each intact. I approached cautiously, brushing my glove against one. The fabric was warm. Inside, I found sleeping bags laid out, dented in the shape of bodies that had just left. A pair of boots sat by one entrance, laces untied. In another tent, I saw a lantern unlit, its glass clean, as though it had been polished yesterday. Everything felt occupied, except at WASN, single quotes, T, dot, and the warmth. God, the warmth, it wasn't just inside the tents. The entire clearing radiated it, thick and pressing. My breath stopped fogging. Sweat prickled on my neck, even though the air outside had been freezing moments before. I checked the small thermometer clipped to my pack. Outside, it had read 41. Here, it said 62. I whispered hello, my voice trembling despite myself. No one answered. Then the whispering began. Not the rustle of leaves or a trick of the wind, but layered voices, low and urgent, like a crowd muttering behind a wall. I turned in place, flashlight low, heart pounding. The voices slid around me, just out of reach, one on top of another. And then, clear as day, I heard my name. I froze. The voice wasn't anyone I knew, but it spoke my name with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a guy line. At the far edge of the clearing, the blue glow flickered again, hovering between the trees. That was enough, I whispered. I'm leaving now to no one in particular, and backed out of the camp. The whispering surged, a rush of hissing consonants, and I swear I heard laughter threaded through it, a tired, joyless laugh. I turned and half ran down the trail, branches lashing my arms, until I burst back into my own camp. But my camp wasn't the same. My fire had burned low, glowing coals, in the ring of stones. The tent was intact, my cooler untouched, but the air was warm, unnaturally warm, as though someone had been sleeping inside my tent with the flaps shut tight. When I pressed a hand to the fabric, it was hot, like touching a dryer door right after. A cycle. My sleeping bag was damp with heat sweat when I pulled it out. The thermometer read 64. I sat awake all night, rifle across my knees, fire crackling low. The woods had gone silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It pressed against my ears, too heavy, too absolute. Once, near midnight, I heard footsteps on the ridge above me. They never resolved into actual steps, just a half sound that stopped when I raised my head. At 2 a.m, I heard a whistle, 2 low notes, one high, the exact whistle my father had used too. Call me back to camp when I was a boy. It came from up the slope and never repeated. I whispered his name without thinking, and instantly regretted it. When dawn broke pale and gray, I packed in a frenzy, my hands clumsy with exhaustion. By 7 a.m., I was back at my truck, heart still thudding. I didn't turn the radio on for the entire drive back into town. 2 weeks later, scrolling a local hunting forum, I saw a thread titled "Strange Camp on Cold Knob." A man described stumbling across 4 canvas tents, perfectly set, sleeping bags inside, boots by the flap, but no people. His story was from 2017. In the comments, someone else swore they'd seen the same camp in 2009. Another claimed his grandfather had told him the story back in the 70s about 4 men who went up to Cold Knob and never came back, leaving their camp as though they'd just stepped out. Search parties found nothing. Now, I don't hunt anymore. Not because I fear the woods, but because I know those tents are still up there, still warm, still waiting. And the worst part is, I know if I ever see that blue lantern again, I won't be able to stop myself from following. It was the kind of morning where the fog didn't just hang in the valleys. It swallowed everything whole. I drive a school bus in Wise County, Texas. Out here, the roads snake around hills and through patches of mesquite and oak, and on damp. Mornings like that one, the fog settles so thick it feels alive. This was last October, a little after 6 in the morning. And I remember it so clearly because I've thought about it almost every day since. The air smelled of wet cedar, and the headlights of the bus cut tunnels through the gray, bouncing off the mist in a way that made every branch and fence post look like something waiting. I was taking my usual route along Farm Road 455, headed toward the switchbacks near mile marker 13. The kids I pick up live out scattered on ranches and trailers, tucked into the hills, so I have to navigate that stretch twice a day. I've been driving this same road for 8 years, and I could tell you every turn blindfolded. The bus rattled and hummed, the heater clicking as it struggled to keep the windows from fogging up. I sipped my coffee, tapping the wheel with my thumb, listening to the radio static because the signal never holds that deep in the hills. Everything felt ordinary until it didn't. As I approached the switchbacks, I noticed the fog thickening in a strange way. It wasn't rolling like normal. It was pooled low, as if something was holding it there in place. The road tilted upward, and I slowed down, knowing how sharp the turns get. That's when I saw a curve I swear has never been there before. Normally, there are 3 tight switchbacks in a row, each hugging the hillside. But that morning there was a 4th, looping hard to the left around a slope I didn't recognize. I actually muttered out loud, "What the hell?" and tightened my grip on the wheel. I thought maybe I was disoriented from the fog. Maybe I had miscounted. But I've driven those switchbacks in rain, in sleet, in dead of night, and they've never changed. The bus groaned as I eased it into the new curve. It was sharp, sharper than the others, and it felt wrong, like the road was pulling me somewhere I shouldn't go. The headlights hit a row of trees I'd never seen before, twisted oaks that leaned out over the pavement, their branches clawing at the fog. Halfway through the curve, I noticed something else, the mile marker sign. It was another 13. My stomach dropped. There's only 1 mile marker 13 on that road, but here I was, staring at another. The sign looked old, bent, and coated in grime, as if it had been there for decades. I slowed almost to a crawl, my coffee sloshing in the cup holder. The kids weren't on board yet, thank God. Because my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the wheel straight. When I came out of the curve, the road stretched ahead like nothing had happened. The usual 3 switchbacks were behind me, and the familiar straightaway leading toward the first pickup was in front. My heart hammered as I checked the mirrors, half expecting to see the phantom curve vanish into the fog. But all I saw was the empty gray swallowing the road behind. Later that morning, Asked one of the high schoolers, a girl named Tessa who rides every day, she'd ever noticed anything strange about mile marker 13. She gave me this flat look, like I'd just told her a bad joke. "You mean the wrecks?" she asked. I pressed her on it, and she said that people always crash near that spot, especially on foggy mornings. Locals call it the cursed mile, but I'd never heard that before. When I told her I thought I'd seen an extra curve, she went pale and turned to look out the window, muttering, "You shouldn't talk about it." My uncle saw it once too. He's dead now. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the drive, the feel of the wheel fighting me on that curve, the way the headlights picked out those unfamiliar oaks. I even pulled up satellite maps on my laptop, tracing the road turn by turn. Just 3 switchbacks, like always. No extra curve, no extra mile marker. But I know what I drove. I know what I saw. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same conditions, heavy fog, damp air, the smell of cedar. And again, there it was. The extra curve, bending left where there shouldn't be one. This time, though, I swear I saw something standing at the edge of the fog, just beyond the fake mile marker. A figure, tall and still, impossible to make out. In the blur of mist and headlights, my instinct was to look away, to not let it see me notice. By the time I rounded the bend, the straightaway returned. Like nothing had been wrong at all, I started dreading foggy mornings. I thought about quitting, but what would I even say? That the road sometimes makes itself longer. That there's something out there waiting in the mist. Every time I drive that stretch now, I feel the air grow colder and I grip the wheel so tightly my hands ache. The other drivers don't mention it, at least not to me, but I catch them giving each other looks at the depot. The kind that say there are stories no one wants to repeat. The last time I saw the phantom switchback was in January. This time, when I passed the mile marker, the fog lifted just enough for me to see the slope beyond. There were dozens of wrecked cars down there, rusted frames tangled in the brush, far more than should have been possible. Some looked ancient, like they'd been sitting for 50 years. My headlights flashed across broken glass, twisted metal. A school bus half buried in the trees that looked eerily similar to mine. My stomach twisted and I jerked my eyes back to the road. When I dared to glance again, the slope was gone, swallowed up by fog. I've never told my supervisor. I've never told the parents. I barely even talked to my wife about it, because I see the way she looks at me when I try, but I need to say it here to someone. The road past mile marker 13 doesn't always stay the same. When the fog is heavy enough, it makes room for something else, something that isn't supposed to be there. And whatever waits in that phantom switchback, it's watching. Every morning now, when I reach that stretch, I find myself whispering a prayer under my breath. Because one of these days, I know the bus won't come back out of that curve. And when it happens, no one will believe there was ever a fourth switchback at all. It was in late October of 2022 in McDowell County, West Virginia, when I made the worst mistake of my life. The air was already sharp with the bite of fall, the kind of chill that rattles through the hollers and makes the last leaves cling to the trees like they're afraid of what's waiting on the ground. I had driven down from Charleston that morning, my little Honda Civic humming over cracked mountain roads, past rows of houses with sagging porches and rusted appliances scattered in the yards. The sun never seemed to reach this part of the state. Was always shadowed, dim, even at noon. I was there to urban explore. That's my thing. Some people go fishing, some play softball on weekends. I break into old buildings, mines, and factories to take photos and feel like I'm touching history. Call it nostalgia. Call it obsession. I've been at it for nearly a decade. But there's one place I'd read about that always gnawed at me, The old company's store in Hemphill. It had been sealed up since the 1950s, when the coal company folded and the last miners drifted out. Folks said it wasn't just closed, it was bricked shut. Like someone was trying to keep something in? The locals didn't like talking about it. I asked a woman at a gas station about it while I was buying a Coke and a bag of peanuts. She froze. Eyes fixed on me for just a little too long, then muttered, "Ain't nothing there worth seeing," before walking out and leaving her change on the counter. That was all the encouragement I needed. I wanted to see the nothing worth seeing. By the time I parked near the tracks, it was late afternoon. The store sat up a little rise, its frame sagging but still sturdy, like a skeleton that refused to fall. Windows were boarded. The door was bricked over in rough red stone, black mortar holding it together. Someone had taken the trouble to smear coal dust across the seams. The whole building smelled faintly metallic, like damp iron. I circled around the back, crunching over dead weeds, and found where the basement coal chute had collapsed inward. A hole gaped in the foundation, just wide enough for me to crawl through. My flashlight beam caught old cobwebs and a rusting cartwheel. The air that pushed out from inside wasn't just stale, it was heavy, thick with the smell of stone, oil, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I slipped in, dragging my backpack behind me. The basement opened up wider than I expected. Rows of shelves still stocked with rusted cans and broken glass jars. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. I took a few pictures, my camera flash lighting up yellowed posters on the wall, advertising soap and tobacco from another century. That's when I noticed them brass tags. They hung from hooks along the wall. Hundreds of them, each with a number stamped into its face. I knew what they were. Miners used to take them when they went underground. Your tag was still on the wall at the end of shift. It meant you never came back. The hooks were full, though some tags lay scattered on the floor like teeth. My beam caught one that had been bent nearly in half. The number still clear, 117. That's when I heard it. A faint clinking sound, like metal against metal. I froze, holding my breath. It wasn't steady, was rhythmic. I swept my light over the wall, and I swear to God I saw the tags swaying. Just barely, as if someone had brushed past them. I muttered, "Nope," under my breath and backed toward the chute. Then, from the darkness, I heard them. A counting, not. Voices exactly it, was softer than that. A whisper threaded through the sound of the brass tags clinking. Numbers, steady and falling. 10, 9, 8. I told myself I was hearing my own fear, that maybe water was dripping somewhere in the dark, and my mind twisted it. But the counting didn't stop. My light caught the far wall, where a narrow stairway rose up toward what used to be the store floor. The steps were sagging, boards split and damp, but the counting was louder there, like it was beckoning me upward. I climbed against every instinct because the chute suddenly felt like it had collapsed tighter behind me. Each step groaned, dust rising in clouds around my boots. At the top, the basement opened into the store proper. The place was cavernous, shelves half collapsed. A cash register still perched on the counter like it was waiting for someone. And the tags, God help me, they were louder now, the clinking coming from all around, though no breeze stirred. 7. 6. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice cracked, dry in the stale air. No answer, just the counting, sliding down, like a clock winding toward 0. That's when I realized the tags weren't just clinking randomly, they were striking in sequence. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I could see them swinging, one after another, in a wave that rolled across the wall. Each tag clicked against its neighbor, marking another number in the countdown. 5. I don't remember pulling my camera up, but the shutter clicked and the flash burst across the room. In that instant, the light caught something I wish I could forget. Shadows of men, dozens of them, standing in rows between the shelves. Helmets low, faces blackened, eyes like pits. They weren't looking at me. They were staring at the hooks, waiting. The flash died, and the room was empty again. But the tags hadn't stopped. 3, 2. I ran. I didn't care if the chute tore me apart. I dove through it, scraping my arms raw on the stone. I tumbled out into the dead grass, the sound of metal still clinking in my ears. I swear I could still hear them counting as I scrambled to my car. Gravel spitting under my tires as I peeled down the road. I didn't stop until I hit Welch, where the neon from a Family Dollar felt like salvation. I sat in the parking lot, trembling, staring at my camera. I don't know why I even checked it. The photo I'd taken was there, clear as day. The shelves, the counter, the wall of tags. But the shadows weren't in it, except one, a shape, a darker than the rest, standing. At the far end of the aisle, helmet low, eyes like pits. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. The brass tags, they didn't stop at one. The wave of swinging, the clinking metal, I could hear them still, faintly, long after I left. I still hear them sometimes. When I'm alone, in the silence before sleep, counting down, 10, 9, 8. And I don't know what happens when they reach 0. It was late October of 2019, and the first frost had already come down over Letcher County, Kentucky. I remember that morning vividly because I was driving out along Highway 7, past Esom, with the leaves burning red and orange on the ridges. A thin mist clinging to the valleys. I had worked as a home health nurse for nearly 8 years by then, and the routine had settled into me like the hills themselves, steady, familiar, predictable. I had my patient list in the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee wedged between my knees, and the radio low enough to barely hear the static between the gospel stations. Dry Fork was at the end of my route that morning. A scattering of houses lay up in the holler, some clinging to the road like they might slip off into the creek if it rose another inch. That creek had been bad since the floods earlier, that spring brown water rushing over banks, carrying trees, and sometimes trailers downstream. Folks had died in those floods, or at least that's what I'd heard when I sat in the break room listening to the older nurses. My last patient of the day was listed as Mr. Darrell Combs, 74, hypertension, post-stroke. Recovery. Nothing unusual about that. I'd seen him twice before in the little house off Lower Dry Fork. It's a weather-beaten place with tar paper on one side where siding had peeled away. He lived alone, no wife or kids mentioned in his chart. When I pulled up, the air was damp and heavy. The house was quiet except for the faint clatter of the creek stones rolling in the current. I knocked on the door, heard the shuffle of feet, and then the door opened to the same man I'd seen before, thin, wiry, with tobacco-stained fingers and a gray beard that spread unevenly along his jaw. "Morning, Mr. Combs," I said. He nodded, muttered a hello, and let me in. His blood pressure was higher than I liked, but stable. We talked about the weather, about how he'd lost a shed in the flood, about his trouble sleeping. It was routine, and I charted everything before leaving. But here's where things start to go sideways. The next week, I've got another order for a home visit to Darrell Combs, 74, hypertension, post-stroke recovery. Same chart, same meds, same note about flood damage. But the address was different. This time it was listed as Upper Dry Fork, about 5 miles further up. I thought maybe the agency had finally corrected the file. Addresses get mixed up all the time out here. So I drove up. This second house was newer, brick veneer with a satellite dish crooked on the roof. I knocked, and to my surprise, the same man answered the door. Same gray beard, same wiry frame, though maybe a little more hunched. "You moved?" I asked, half joking. Been here all my life, he said flatly, like I'd insulted him. Inside? The place smelled of wood smoke and fried potatoes. The furniture was different. The photos on the walls were of the same man, but younger weddings, hunting trips, even what looked like a family reunion. He let me take his vitals, and everything was nearly identical to what I'd recorded a week before. When I asked if he'd had anyone helping him after the flood, he shook his head. Wasn't no flood up here. You got me mixed with somebody else. That stuck in my head on the drive home. I checked the charts again, side by side, and everything matched except the addresses. Same man, same diagnosis. Same notes about his mannerisms, his speech, his mobility. I told myself maybe it was just a cousin with the same name. Happens out. Here, families run deep in the mountains, and you'll meet 5 Combs men in the same holler without them ever bothering to change a first name. But I couldn't shake the unease that it wasn't just a mix-up. The following week, the order came. In again. Daryl Combs, 74. This time, the address was a trailer down a gravel spur off Middle Dry Fork. I drove out, my stomach tight with something I couldn't explain. The trailer sat half-sunk on cinder blocks, with tarps stretched over one end. Door opened before I could knock, and there he was again. Same man. Same beard. Afternoon, Mr. Combs, I said carefully. He studied me like he didn't know me. You're the nurse? Yes, sir. Inside, the trailer smelled of damp carpet and mildew. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, buzzing faintly. I asked him about his stroke, about how he was managing. He answered slowly, like it hurt him to remember. And when I mentioned the floods, he spat onto the floor. Lost my brother in that flood. House washed clean away down on Lower Dry Fork. Don't talk about it. I froze. My chart said Daryl Combs. This man said it was his brother who died in the flood. In the same house I'd visited first. I drove back with my hands shaking on the wheel. 3 houses. 3 men. Same name, same age, same face, each convinced. The others weren't alive. I went to my supervisor the next morning, laid out all 3 charts on her desk. She frowned, flipped through them, and finally said, "Looks like duplicate files. I'll merge them." "No," I said, maybe too sharply. "They're not duplicates. I've seen them. They're different houses, different men." She gave me that tired look people give when they think you've been working too many hours. "Honey, just write it up and I'll fix it in the system." But I couldn't let it go. I drove back out to Lower Dry Fork that weekend, not on the clock. Just on my own time. The first house sat dark, the windows boarded. The front door was locked with a chain. It looked like no one had lived there in years. Up on Upper Dry Fork. The brick house stood quiet too, though the curtains had been drawn tight, I thought. I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I knocked, no one came. The trailer on Middle Dry Fork was the last place I tried. It was gone, not destroyed, not burned, just gone. The cinder blocks still sat in the mud, but the trailer had vanished. Like someone had hooked it to a truck and hauled it away in the night. I stood there for a long time, the creek murmuring. In the distance, the trees pressing close. I could smell damp earth and leaves rotting underfoot. I swear I heard someone cough behind me, but when I turned, the holler was empty. I never saw another order for Daryl Combs after that. His name disappeared from the patient list entirely. When I asked my supervisor, she shrugged and said, "Must've been discharged." But sometimes, driving those roads, I catch sight of him, standing in the doorway of a sagging house. Sitting on a porch up the holler, watching me as I pass, each time. I swear it's the same face, and I don't know which house is real, or which man is alive, if any of them are at all. I only know that Dry Fork still floods when the rains come down hard. And when the water rises. High enough, it feels like the whole holler is trying to wash itself clean. But some things don't wash away. They just come back, over and over, waiting for someone to knock on the door. It was late summer when this happened, August 19th, 2022, to be exact. I only remember the date so clearly because it was the week after my grandfather's funeral, and I had taken to spending nights out at Norris Lake just to clear my head. I've always been a night angler. The lake at night is a different world, quiet, heavy with mist, the water black and still like glass, broken only by the occasional slap of a carp or the rustle of a raccoon nosing along the shoreline. That night, the air was warm and still, hovering in the low 70s, and the moon was hidden behind a thin gauze of clouds. I'd driven out to a place the locals call Little Egypt Hollow, a stretch of shoreline tucked back behind a stand of crooked sycamores. It's a forgotten spot, not much used anymore, with an old gravel pull-off that hasn't been maintained in years. The grass had swallowed most of the road, and the hollow itself was dark and low, like the earth sagged in on itself there. I parked, killed the engine, and just sat in silence for a few minutes. You could smell the water stale and mineral, tinged with that algae scent that always rises in the summer heat. The only other sound was the ticking of the engine as it cooled, and the whine of insects in the tree line. I set up near a half-rotted dock that still jutted out a few yards into the lake. The boards were soft under my boots, warped and splintered, but stable enough to fish from. I threaded night crawlers onto my line, dropped my rig, and let the water take it. The surface rippled, caught a faint sheen from the moon as the clouds shifted, and then everything settled into stillness again. For the first couple hours, it was ordinary, almost boring. I caught a few small bass, nothing worth keeping, and spent more time leaning back in my chair, watching the stars blink through gaps in the drifting clouds. The night felt thick. Not bad, exactly, but close. I don't know how else to put it. Like the air was full of something unsaid. Around midnight, I noticed the noises of the woods behind me had dulled. The insects weren't as loud, and the occasional frog croak from the shallows had gone silent. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes things just go quiet. But that quiet had a weight to it, like someone was standing over me, waiting. That's when I felt the tug. Hard, sudden. The kind of pull that yanks the rod tip down toward the water and demands everything from you to hold it. My chair scraped across the dock as I lurched forward, bracing, dragging back. Whatever was on the line wasn't thrashing like a fish. Not in the way you'd expect. No darting side to side, no surface splashes. It was a steady pull, deep and deliberate, like I'd hooked into a log that had suddenly decided it wanted to leave. My forearms burned as I tried to keep control. I leaned back, teeth clenched, whispering "Jesus Christ" through them. Then the line slackened for half a breath, just enough to make me think it had broken before it surged again with a strength that almost ripped the rod from my grip. The dock creaked beneath me, nails groaning in the wood. I dug in my heels, pulling back, and that's when I heard it. A sound rising out from across the water, low and humming, almost like someone singing under their breath. The tune was slow, mournful, and faint, but I recognized it immediately. It was the same hymn they'd sung at my grandfather's funeral the week before, "Shall We Gather at the River?" My hands went cold on the rod. The voice wasn't clear, like it wasn't above the water, but inside it, carrying through the line itself, vibrating up the graphite and into my bones. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might faint. The pull on the line slowed, steadied. I felt the weight pause just below the dock, directly under me. The singing grew louder, clearer. It was my grandfather's voice, not a memory of it, not something my head conjured up. It was him, full and real, the same cracked, worn voice I'd heard my whole life. He was calling the hymn out as if he were right beneath me, rising up from the black water. Shall we gather at the river? The beautiful river. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. My grandfather had been buried in a closed casket because he hadn't looked like himself by the end. Now his voice was here, under me, beneath this dock in Little Egypt Hollow. I staggered back, dropping the rod. The line went taut, thrummed like a violin string, and then snapped with a crack that echoed out over the lake. The sound died away, the water went still, and I was left with only the whisper of insects starting back up in the trees. My chest was heaving, sweat running down my temples, but I couldn't make myself move. I just stood there, staring at the black water that looked no different than before, smooth and calm and unknowable. Finally, I gathered myself enough to reel in what was left of the line. The hook was gone, but the end of the line was slick with something that wasn't water. It was thick, like mucus, and it reeked of earth-wet dirt, like the inside of a grave after rain. I wiped it off on the boards, but the smell clung to my skin, sour and heavy, until I scrubbed my hands raw the next morning. I packed up and left in silence, headlights cutting through the hollow like blades. I didn't even look back at the lake as I pulled onto the overgrown road. All the way home, my grandfather's voice played in my head, the hymn rising and falling in that same broken timbre. I told myself I was tired, grief-stricken, imagining things. That's what you tell yourself when there's no good explanation. But the line, the pull, that smelly can't explain those away. I haven't gone back to Little Egypt Hollow since. Hell, I haven't been night fishing at all. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear the faint hum of chaos, that hymn under my window, like it's traveling up through the pipes, echoing through the water lines. It's never loud, never intrusive, just there, waiting, and I know. With a kind of certainty that makes my stomach churn, that one night I'll wake to find that same steady pull again, dragging me out of bed and down toward the dark. It was Saturday, October 21st, 2023. I know the exact date because I'd written it at the top of my running log the night before. The log is still sitting in my closet, the last page I ever filled out, marked with a shaky pen line where my hand couldn't stop trembling. I had driven out to the Pisgah National Forest early that morning. The weather was one of those rare fall days in North Carolina, clear, crisp air, temperature hovering around 50 degrees at sunrise. Leaves painted in every shade of red and orange. Widow's Creek Trail is one of my favorites. Not too crowded if you hit it before noon, but still enough of a path to push a good 7 miles without tripping on roots every other step. I parked my car at the trailhead around 7:40 a.m., laced up, stretched, and started my watch. The first mile passed with the usual steady rhythm. Crunch of gravel, birdsong above, the faint rush of water off to the left. It was one of those runs where your body feels loose, light, almost like you could go forever. I'd hit about mile 3 when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was just my breathing echoing strangely, or maybe a deer pacing me deeper in the woods, but no. The sound was too precise. It was running, not heavy, not dragging, but a perfect mimic of my cadence. Except there were no footfalls. If you've ever run trails with someone, you know the sound. Shoes slapping dirt, leaves crunching, rocks scattering. This was different. I could hear movement, the faint swish of disturbed air, but nothing touched the ground. It was like my shadow had grown a body, except the body was keeping just far. Enough behind me to stay invisible. I slowed down, pretending to check my watch, and the sound slowed too. My steps crunched to a stop, and the forest filled with silence. Nothing. No breathing but my own. No movement except a squirrel darting up a hickory tree. I told myself I was being paranoid. drank a sip from my hydration pack, and picked up the pace again. For about 2 minutes, it was just me and the woods. Then it started again. A presence falling into step behind me, perfectly matching my cadence 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, but still no contact with the ground by the time I reached mile 5. I was convinced someone was screwing with me. Maybe another runner with soft shoes. Maybe some hiker trying to mess with me. I cut across a switchback, sharp and fast, hoping to catch whoever it was off guard. But when I whipped my head back, nothing. Just empty trail winding behind me. Leaves drifting down in slow motion. At mile 6, the trail narrowed into a denser section where the canopy blotted out most of the sun. The air got cooler, damp, and I swear the smell shifted from autumn leaves to something heavier like wet earth that had been disturbed too recently. That's when I realized it wasn't just the sound. My strides weren't mine anymore. Something was syncing with me, forcing my legs into the exact rhythm it wanted. When I tried to slow just a little, my muscles fought me. Like I wasn't fully in control of my own body. Panic burned up through my chest. I stopped dead, bent over, hands on my knees, gasping. The forest went silent again, but the silence felt wrong, like it was holding its breath with me. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, but a faint whisper right against the back of my neck, even though no one was there. A single word stretched thin and broken. Run. I don't know why I obeyed, but I did. I sprinted. Harder than I ever had in my life, lungs ripping, legs screaming. The thing followed. I could feel it, not behind me anymore, but around me, like the woods themselves had learned how to run. No footsteps, no panting, just that invisible rhythm, beating inside my head, forcing me faster and faster. When my watch buzzed at mile 7, I expected relief. Widow's Creek Trail loops back toward the trailhead there, and I could already picture my car waiting. Instead, the path I knew twisted. Wrong? The trees pressed in close, bending at angles they shouldn't. Every landmark I usually clocked fallen log, creek crossing, rock outcropping was gone. It was as if the trail had stretched itself into something endless, feeding me forward, but never letting me out. I don't remember how long I ran like that. My watch said 19 minutes from the first time I heard it, but it felt longer, like hours. At some point, my vision tunneled, and I just kept going because the alternative felt worse. Finally, the sound broke. The rhythm stopped. I stumbled to a halt, chest heaving, and realized I was standing at the trailhead again. My car in front of me, sunlight slanting through the trees exactly the way it had that morning, as if nothing had happened. I tore off my watch, stuffed it in the glove compartment, and drove home shaking so badly I nearly ran to red lights. That was 10 months ago. I haven't been back to Pisgah since. But the part I can't explain what still makes me nauseous every time. I lace up for runs that the rhythm never really left. At night, lying in bed, I'll feel it press into my calves and thighs, pulling me into that same cadence. On good nights, I can ignore it. On bad ones, I'll jolt awake, drenched in sweat, heart pounding to the same silent beat. And last week, while walking down my street in broad daylight, I heard it again. Not behind me, beside me. Perfectly in step, but still without footfalls. Matching me stride for stride, daring me to stop. I haven't gone for a run since, but I know it's only waiting. It was the summer of 2014, late June, when I first heard about the coal train in Mingo County. At the time, I was working as a brakeman out of Williamson, mostly odd hours, long nights, and lonely stretches of track. That kind of work makes you superstitious, whether you believe in ghosts or not. The older hands were always passing down stories, men cut in half by boxcars that kept walking, lights on abandoned lines, whistles blowing where no trains had run in decades. Most of it was just talked to keep the night from getting too quiet. But one story never got told with a laugh. The Thursday 2:11. The way it was explained to me. Every Thursday morning at exactly 2:11 a.m., a single coal car moves down a decommissioned line near Delbarton. The line was supposed to have been pulled up years ago, but a section remained, overgrown, rusted, and useless. No engines, no crews, no schedules. And yet, if you were standing near the trestle that cut over the tug fork, you'd hear steel wheels screeching, a low whistle that didn't belong to anything living, and a single loaded car rattling through, slow and steady. The veterans swore it carried wet gravel, though no one explained why that detail mattered. They just shook their heads like it wasn't the kind of thing you questioned. I didn't believe it, not really. I thought it was another ghost tale designed to keep rookies awake at night. But one Thursday, I had a layover in Kermit and couldn't sleep. The motel AC was busted, the sheets smelled like mildew, and the road outside was full of coal trucks, grinding their gears. Around 1 in the morning, I thought of that story, and, maybe out of boredom, or maybe curiosity, I decided to see for myself. The night was thick with humidity, the kind where your shirt clings to you like you've been swimming. Fireflies blinked lazily over the weeds, and the tug fork smelled like rot and diesel. I parked my truck at the edge of an old service road and walked the rest of the way to the trestle. Every step felt like I was trespassing on ground I had no business being on. The ties were warped, the steel rails flecked with rust, and kudzu had climbed up half the structure. You could tell nobody had touched it in years. I sat on the embankment with a thermos of coffee, trying to convince myself I was just wasting time. The crickets were loud, and a bullfrog croaked somewhere by the water. Around 1:50, I started to get jumpy. I kept glancing at my watch, telling myself I'd leave before 2. Then 2 o'clock came, and I thought, just a little longer. By 2:10, my chest was tight like I'd swallowed a stone. When my watch ticked 2 to 11, the air went dead silent. I mean, everything stopped. No frogs, no crickets, not even the distant hum of trucks. And then I felt it before I heard it, the vibration under the soil like something heavy rolling closer. A screech of metal followed, distant at first, then growing. I stood, staring down the tracks, and sure enough, around the bend came a coal car, just one. No engine, no caboose, nothing to pull it. Its wheels shrieked against the rust, yet it moved, smooth, steady, unstoppable. The load inside shifted with a wet, grinding sound. That's when I smelled it, a damp mineral stink, like gravel soaked in stagnant pond water. I froze as it rolled past. The car was old, marked with a company logo that hadn't been painted in decades. Rainwater dripped from the sides even. Though the night was dry, as it passed, I swear I heard something mixed in with the rattle of stone. Not voices exactly, but a kind of muffled groaning, like dozens of throats buried under rock. The car crossed the trestle, wheels sparking on corroded steel, and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. I expected it to stop at the end of the dead line, but it didn't. It just kept rolling until the night swallowed it whole. I don't remember walking back to my truck. I just remember the sound fading, the crickets starting up again, and my hands shaking so bad I spilled coffee down my shirt. When I finally got to the motel, it was 3 o'clock, and I locked the door like that would keep whatever I'd seen out. I told one of the older brakemen about it the next day, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, he got quiet and said, "Don't watch it twice." He wouldn't explain, just repeated himself and walked away. I should have listened. 2 weeks later, I went back. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I dreamed about that groaning noise, about the smell of wet stone, about the way the air went silent. It felt like an itch under my skin. So I found myself at the trestle again. Same spot, same time. 2:11 came, and right on cue, the night died. The rails began to tremble, and out of the dark came that lone car. Only this time, it wasn't empty around it. Ha! I swear on my life, I saw shapes walking beside it. Dark figures, trudging in step with the wheels, their heads bowed low. They weren't solid, more like shadows cut out of the air itself. As the car passed, one of them lifted its head, and I caught a face pale, wet, caked with gravel. Its eyes met mine, and its mouth opened, but no sound came out. My stomach dropped as if the trestle had given way beneath me. I bolted before the car had fully passed, stumbling down the embankment, skinning my palms on the rocks. I didn't look back until I was in my truck, engine roaring. Even then, I saw the car vanish into the trees, the shadows trailing it like a funeral procession. I've never gone back, but I still hear it. Every Thursday night, if I'm awake, I'll catch the faintest echo of wheels on steel, even when I'm 100 miles away. Sometimes, in the quiet, I smell that wet gravel again, like it's seeped into my clothes and skin. And last week, I woke at 2:11 to the sound of something heavy grinding through my street. Though there are no tracks anywhere near my house, I don't know what that train is carrying, or who's walking beside it, but I know this much. Whatever rides that line, it doesn't stop. It's not for rust, not for time, and not for the living. And if you ever find yourself in Mingo County near the Tug Fork Trestle on a Thursday night, don't wait around to see it. Because once it notices you, it will always know where to find you. It was late October 1999 in Sylva, North Carolina. The air had that restless kind of chill that rolls down from the Smoky Mountains after sundown. Sharp enough to bite at your ears, soft enough to let you think you could stay outside a little longer than you should. The sky was thin and brittle with stars, the kind of night where sound carries farther than it ought to, where every dog chained in every yard will bark at the same strange gust moving down the valley. I remember all of that too clearly because that was the night I did the dumbest thing I ever did as a teenager. I followed my best friend, Jake, into the graveyard of the soft pines. Everyone in town knew about that hill cemetery outside Sylva. It wasn't big, maybe 50 or 60 headstones. Some of them so old and crooked they leaned like teeth rotting out of the hillside. Nobody called it by the name on the rusting metal sign St. Andrew's Rest. To us, two kids who grew up there, it was just the graveyard of the soft pines. The trees clumped so tightly on the ridgeline that the wind made a whistling, almost human sound when it pushed through, like sighs you couldn't place. Old people said you didn't go up there at night. They said it wasn't the dead that would bother you, but the dogs. Jake had a chipped grin and a mean streak for dares. The kind of kid who never learned a line until he dared you to cross it. That night, he lit a Marlboro behind the food line and said, "We go up there, we stay 5 minutes, we're legends. You in?" I was 16, stupid, and in love with the idea of not being the coward in the group. So of course, I said yes. I told him to meet me at the bottom of the ridge at 11:30 when my folks were asleep. The path up was a mess of roots and loose gravel, and the cold dew clung to everything. You could smell the pine sap leaking from broken branches, sticky and sweet, mixing with the faint rot of leaves. By the time we crested the hill, my hoodie was damp, and my breath came out in hard clouds. The cemetery was smaller than it felt in the stories, just a clearing of crooked markers lit by the moon. The fences were half fallen, and the grass had grown long enough to hide your shoes. Jake was grinning like an idiot, holding up his lighter like a lantern. Told you, it was nothing. Just some rocks and sticks. He kicked at a headstone like it was a mailbox. I remember flinching at the hollow sound it made, stone on stone. And then, as if on cue, every dog in town started barking. It was like a wave rolling down the valley. First one hound bang, then another, until it felt like the whole of Silva was awake. You could hear them through the trees, echoing from the trailers down by the gas station, from the porches of houses tucked into the hollows, a frenzy of barking that made the night feel too thin, too fragile. It felt like we'd pressed a button we weren't supposed to. Jake laughed. See, we're famous already. Woke the whole damn county. I wanted to laugh with him, but my gut went cold. Because behind us, right there in the graveyard clearing, there was silence. Not a bark, not a sound. Just silence. Broken by the crunch of pine needles under weight that wasn't ours. I turned first. I don't know why it was instinct, like when your skin prickles before thunder. And I saw it. A dog. Big, black. It was standing between the stones, not 10 feet behind us. No collar, no tags. Its chest barely moved, like it wasn't breathing. Its eyes caught the moonlight, but they didn't flash like normal eyes. They just held steady, pale, and flat, like river stones underwater. Shit, I whispered. Jake turned and saw it too. He went quiet for the first time that night. Neither of us moved. The barks from down the valley kept going, louder, echoing, but up there on that hill, the only sound was the dry shuffle of pine needles when the dog shifted one step forward. "Don't run," Jake said. His voice cracked. "Dogs chase if you run." So we didn't. We stood stiff and stupid, two kids pretending we weren't terrified. The dog tilted its head, slow, deliberate, like it was trying to figure out what we were. Then it walked past a grave marker, and for a second just one it wasn't there. I mean, I saw it walk behind the stone, but it never came out the other side. The grave marker wasn't wide enough to hide it, but it was gone. The space where it should have been was empty, just grass and shadow. Jake swore under his breath. No, no, nope. He grabbed my arm, hard enough to bruise, and we started backing toward the path. My legs felt heavy, like moving through water. Every hair on my neck was standing straight up. That's when the barks started to die off, one by one. Not fading, stopping, like someone was cutting wires. Within seconds, the valley was silent. Too silent. No dogs, no crickets. Not even the wind through the pines. Just our breath, quick and shallow. We made it to the edge of the clearing, where the trees began again, and I thought maybe we'd left it behind. But just as we turned down the trail, I heard it. A low growl. Not behind us, not in front of us. Right next to my ear, as if the air itself was growling. I jumped sideways, nearly falling down the slope. There was nothing there. Just Jake, wide-eyed, pale in the moonlight. We didn't talk after that. We just ran. I don't even remember how we got down the hill, only that my lungs burned and my hoodie snagged on a branch and tore. When we hit the asphalt of the service road at the bottom, Jake bent over, hands on his knees, gasping. I thought he might puke. I couldn't stop shaking. The town was dark around us, quiet, not a single dog barking anymore. Jake finally looked at me and said, "We don't talk about this." His voice was hoarse, dead serious. I nodded. We walked home in silence, splitting off at the corner like nothing had happened. That was more than 20 years ago. I left Silva for good after high school. I don't talk to Jake anymore. But here's the thing. Every now and then, even here in Tennessee, I'll wake up at night and hear the neighborhood dogs all barking at once. Not panicked. Just barking like they've been startled by something moving through. And then, just as suddenly, they stop. All of them. Silence drops heavy, like a blanket. And in that silence, I swear I hear it again, the sound of pine needles crunching under weight that isn't there. I don't go near graveyards anymore, and I don't keep a dog. It was November 6, 2018, just after the first snow of the season in Randolph County, West Virginia. I remember because the dusting hadn't melted yet, even down in the valleys. And the temperature had dropped enough that every breath turned into a little cloud of vapor. We'd driven out past Seneca Rocks that morning, our truck packed with ropes, helmets, headlamps, backup lights, and enough jerky and water for the day. The plan was to explore the sinks of Gandy again, specifically the lesser-known second passage that runs parallel to the mainstream cave. I'd been caving for nearly a decade. Nothing professional, just a passion that had grown out of weekends in my 20s. My buddy Mark had been doing it longer. He was the one who'd gotten me into it, the one who knew every route, every crawl space, every place you could wedge your shoulders and just barely squeeze through. On that day, it was me, Mark, and his cousin Daniel, who'd tagged along mostly for the thrill. He wasn't inexperienced, but he was green enough that I could sense his nerves from the moment we parked. We got to the cave mouth around 11:30 a.m. The sky was a clear, dull gray, the kind that looks heavy but doesn't quite promise snow. The wind cut sharp when you stood still, so we wasted no time gearing up. The entrance yawned in front of us like a black mouth framed by frost, stiffened weeds. The first passage was wet, shallow, a stream moving steadily along its old course. The second passage branched off further inside, a tight crawl that eventually opened into a broader corridor. It was less known, less traveled, and that was exactly why Mark wanted to go. "Don't drag your feet," Mark said, shouldering his pack. His voice echoed against the stone. "Stay tight to the right. We'll cut into the dry run and loop back." Daniel chuckled nervously. "Yeah, easy for you to say." "Tight's not my strong suit. Relax," Mark said. "It's not half as bad as the horror stories people make it out to be. Just rock and mud." I let them go ahead, taking up the rear, and we ducked into the dark. The first thing you notice is the smell. If you've never been in a cave, it's hard to describe damp stone, mineral-heavy air, the faint organic rot of leaves that get washed inside. Your ears fill with the sound of water dripping, your own boots grinding on gravel, and the way your breath bounces back at you off the walls. I clicked on my headlamp, watched the beams slice through dust motes and the thin vapor of our exhalations. By the time we reached the turnoff into the second passage, our boots were caked in wet silt. The floor tilted upward slightly, and the sound of the stream receded behind us. The rock grew drier, chalkier, the air cooler. My lamp caught faint scratches along the stone-old tool marks, maybe, or the signatures of earlier cavers. The crawl space forced us down to our bellies. I went last, feeling the weight of the rock pressing in, the scrape of stone against my pack as I wriggled forward. It was the kind of squeeze where your heartbeat speeds up a little no matter how many times you've done it. When we finally emerged into the broader corridor, I took a long breath of relief. The air smelled faintly different, there drier, with a trace of something stale, almost like an attic that hadn't been opened in decades. Mark swung his lamp along the ground. "All right," he said. "Stay sharp. It's easy to lose your sense of direction here." That was when Daniel stopped moving. Guys." His voice wavered. He was staring at the ground. I followed his gaze, and my stomach tightened. Boot prints. A pair of them, clear as day, pressed into the dry, chalky silt. The strangest part was the direction they ran opposite ours, as if someone had come from deeper in the cave and was heading back out, except they looked fresh. Not wet, but sharp-edged, like they'd been made minutes before. And we hadn't passed anyone, not at the entrance, not in the crawl. Mark crouched down, his light steady on the prints. "Probably some other group came through earlier," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," I said quietly. "Look at the edges. They'd be smudged if they were hours old." And why only one set? We stood in silence, the weight of the stone around us suddenly heavier, the air colder. Daniel shifted uneasily, his lamp beam trembling on the walls. That was when Mark's light flickered. Just for a second, a tiny hiccup in the beam. He tapped the casing, muttering. Then Daniel's flickered. Then mine. One after another, not random, not overlapping, but in sequence. Mark's, then Daniel's, then mine. Like something had walked past us and touched them in order. I heard it then. A faint scrape, like boot leather against stone, deeper in the passage. Did you hear that? Daniel whispered. Mark raised a hand, signaling silence. We stood perfectly still, our breaths shallow, lamps humming faintly in the dark. The sound came again slow, deliberate, retreating deeper into the cave. We followed, though every instinct screamed at me not to. The prints continued ahead of us, weaving slightly, like whoever made them wasn't in a hurry. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling pressing lower, and the air turned colder still. My lamp flickered again. Not out, but enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Daniel muttered, "I don't like this, man. I don't like this at all." "Just keep moving," Mark said, though his voice had lost its steady edge. We pressed on. The prints led us to a place where the passage split, left or right, both narrowed into dark veins in the stone. The prints went left, but there was something wrong with them now. The stride was off, uneven, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot. I looked back at Daniel, his face pale in the light. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. All three of our lamps cut out at once. Pitch black. The kind of dark you can't imagine unless you felt it. Complete, suffocating. I froze, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the backup light clipped to my belt. Then, just as quickly, my lamp blinked back on. Daniel's too, but not Mark's. I spun toward where he'd been standing. The beam of my lamp hit only rock. No Mark, no sound of movement. "Mark." I called, my voice bouncing back at me in 100 warped echoes. Nothing. Daniel's voice cracked. Where'd he go? I don't know how long we searched, our light stabbing into every crack, every shadow. We shouted his name until our throats burned. No answer, no sound of retreating boots. Just the drip of water, the stale air pressing close, and the prints on the ground, prints that no longer looked like they belonged to just one person. There were more of them now. I don't remember how we got out, just that somehow we retraced our path, crawling, scraping, half blind with panic. When we finally emerged into the pale daylight at the mouth of the cave, Mark wasn't with us. His rope, his helmet, his pack, they never came out. The rescue team combed the sinks for 3 days. They never found him. Sometimes, late at night, I still see it in my head, the way the lamps went dark in order, like someone passing a hand across them one by one. I hear the scrape of boots against stone, that slow, uneven step. And every time I think about it, I wonder, what if we'd taken the right passage instead of the left? Would Mark still be here? Or would it be me who never made it out? It was July 14th, 2021, just after noon when I started up the climb toward Roan High Knob. The air that day was heavy with that southern Appalachian summer humidity, the kind that made my shirt cling and my hat brim drip after only a few miles. The trail wound beneath dense red spruce and Fraser firs, their needles damp and fragrant, the shade broken by the occasional shaft of sunlight slipping through. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for weeks at that point, moving northbound. My legs used to the strain, my mind focused on nothing more than the rhythm of walking and the satisfaction of checking miles off my map. That day, though, was one of those rare stretches when I didn't see another soul. No other hikers, no locals. Not even a deer or a squirrel. Just silence, broken only by the creak of my pack straps and the crunch of my boots on damp earth. It wasn't an ominous silence, not at first, more like peace, the kind you start to crave after long days around shelters full of chatter and headlamp beams. I felt grateful for it. By the time I reached the balds, those strange, grassy clearings. Near the summit, the sun was dipping lower, coloring the ridge in honey gold. From there, you could see for miles, rolling layers of blue mountains folding into each other. I remember stopping to catch my breath, leaning on my trekking poles and scanning the horizon. That was when I saw her. At first I thought it was just another hiker. She was small, standing a good 50 yards off near the edge of the clearing, her figure outlined against the sky. She lifted her arm and waved. It wasn't frantic or playful, just a slow, deliberate wave, like you might give to someone pulling out of your driveway. She looked young, maybe 10 or 11, her hair pale and loose around her shoulders. The sight made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was how still she stood. Maybe it was because I hadn't passed any sign of a campsite cabin or trail junction for hours. I raised a hand back, half-hearted, and started walking toward her, figuring she might be lost. But after a few steps, I glanced down at my map. The paper was creased and damp from sweat. But clear enough, the last homestead in this area had been abandoned almost a century ago. I knew that because I'd read the guide notes just that morning. A little blurb about how the settlers once tried to farm the balds until the soil gave out. 8 miles, the note had said, to the nearest road crossing. When I looked up again, she was gone. I stopped, waiting for her to reappear, scanning the curve of the bald and the tree line beyond. The wind picked up, carrying the sweet smell of fir and something else beneath it, something faintly sour, like old milk. My stomach turned. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, staring at the place where she'd been. Eventually, I told myself it had to have been a trick of the light. The ridges can play with your eyes, that way shadows sliding across grass, a pale stump that looks like a figure until you blink. I tightened my pack straps and kept moving, but that night at the shelter, the strangeness didn't let go. Roan High Knob Shelter is one of the highest on the entire AT, a dark, drafty log cabin that smells of rot and smoke. Only one other hiker was there, a wiry man in his 50s who introduced himself as Rick. He had that jittery, restless air some long-distance hikers get, and when I told him about seeing the girl, his expression changed. "You saw her too," he said, low, almost like he didn't want the words to carry. I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" Rick poked at his dinner with a long spoon, the plastic scraping against his pot. "Folks talk about a girl up here. Been stories for years. Little blonde thing waves at you from the balds. Some say she's looking for her daddy. Some say she's just trying to get you to follow her." I waited for him to grin, to admit he was pulling my leg, but his face stayed blank, his eyes on the pot. "She real?" I asked. "She's something," he muttered. "That's enough." That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the shelter walls, rattling the tin roof until it sounded like bones clattering. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured her standing alone in that golden light, her hand rising slow and steady. And I kept hearing a sound I couldn't place. It's like someone whispering just beyond the range of understanding. Not words exactly, but the rhythm of speech at some point. I must have dozed, because I woke to Rick shaking my shoulder. "Did you hear that?" he hissed. His eyes were wide, his face slick with sweat. "Hear what?" I whispered back. He didn't answer. He just pointed toward the door. The shelter door was ajar, moving slightly in the wind. Beyond it was nothing but black firs and the pale glow of moonlight on grass. For a long moment, I thought I saw her there again, just outside, her hair shifting, as if underwater. Then the wind slammed the door shut. In the morning, Rick was gone. His pack, his gear, everything, just gone. I waited a while, thinking maybe he'd gone to get water or to use the privy, but he never came back. I scrawled, "A note in the shelter log, hiker missing, left overnight. Keep eyes open," and I moved on. I wish I could say that was the end of it. But in the weeks that followed, even miles away from Roan, I kept catching glimpses. A pale shape at the edge of a field. A small hand curling back into the brush. Once, at dusk, when I turned to check behind me on a long stretch of trail, I swear I saw her standing no more than 20 feet away. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared with eyes that looked too dark for her face. I sped up. When I looked again, she was gone. I finished my hike a month later, but something of me stayed on that mountain. Even now, when the wind is right, when the trees sway and the light hits just so, I can see her as clear as I did that first evening. The girl on Roan High Knob, waving slow, asking wordlessly for me to come closer. And the worst part is, I don't think she wants me to follow her anymore. I think she found her way down, because twice now, since I came home, I've woken to the sound of whispering outside my bedroom window. A child's voice, soft and steady. And last night, I swear I saw the outline of a small hand pressing flat against the glass. It was late November when I decided to make the drive out to Welch, West Virginia. I was working freelance assignments at the time, mostly photojournalism jobs for small magazines. And one of my side projects had taken me into documenting old, forgotten towns across Appalachia. Welch wasn't entirely abandoned, still had a population. Though shrinking, but it had that air of being left behind. Where the mountains closed in and the coal companies had drained what they could before retreating, I arrived on the morning of November 21st, 2021. I keep a journal with exact dates and weather details from my shoots. So I can tell you that the day started out overcast, the sky a dull, heavy gray with a fine mist hanging in the air. The temperature hovered in the low 40s. My rental car's windshield wipers squeaked every few minutes, just enough to keep visibility clear as I drove down into the town. The streets were quiet, wet from drizzle, and the whole place smelled faintly of coal, dust, and mildew. I had booked 2 nights at a small, old-fashioned inn run by a couple in their 60s. The husband checked me in. His name was Robert, though. He asked me to call him Bobby. He was friendly enough, though he had that slow, measured way of speaking that made even a greeting feel cautious. When I told him I was a photographer, he gave me a nod, but didn't ask much else. Later that afternoon, I began walking the downtown strip. I snapped photos of shuttered storefronts, old painted advertisements flaking off brick walls, rusted iron signs above businesses long gone. The town had a certain texture to it that felt perfect for what I was documenting. Eventually, I wandered toward an old apartment building near the corner of McDowell and Elkhorn. It was a tall, narrow structure, boarded up on the first floor, and missing patches of roofline. The wood planks covering its windows had gone gray with rot. But I noticed something odd about one of the second-floor windows. From the angle I stood at, the boards didn't quite cover the glass. Between 2 slats, I could see a strip of the pane dark, but intact. It was nothing unusual in itself, but when I raised my camera and took a shot, the LCD preview made me pause. There was a silhouette in the window. It looked like the outline of a person, thin and still, standing just behind the gap in the boards. At first, I assumed someone was inside, maybe a squatter or a local kid, but the angle was strange. The boards were nailed tight. Even if someone was behind the glass, I shouldn't have been able to get such a clear, human shape through such a narrow strip. I brushed it off, zoomed in on the image, but the pixels held the shape. Shoulders, a head tilted slightly to the right. I told myself it was just a trick of reflection. The wet streets, the way my autofocus locked on to the wrong plane. I snapped another. The figure was still there. Here's where it gets stranger. Out of habit, I usually shoot in bursts of 3 rapid-fire exposures. I check the sequence. First frame, nothing unusual. Second frame, normal. Third frame, silhouette. It was like clockwork. Every third shot of that window produced the figure. I tested it. I changed lenses. I shifted angles. I even turned around and photographed a different building. An empty diner across the street. First frame, fine. Second frame, fine. Third frame, the same silhouette, only now it was inside the diners. Boarded up window. That's when I felt my stomach knot. I lowered the camera and glanced back at the apartment. The boards were still there. No movement, no one visible. The streets around me were empty. The only sounds were a distant dog barking and the slow drip of water from a leaky gutter. Must be something with the camera, I muttered out loud, though my voice sounded forced. That evening, back in my in-room, I loaded the shots onto my laptop. I expected to find some glitch, a corrupted sensor line, maybe a bad memory card. But the images were clean. Metadata consistent. No distortion outside of the figure. In fact, the silhouette was sharper than much of the background detail, like it had been captured with perfect focus. I showed the sequence to Bobby the next morning at breakfast. He leaned over my laptop, chewing slowly on a piece of toast. Round. That building's been empty near on 30 years, he said. Ain't no one been up in there since they condemned it. I asked him if there were stories, maybe, about hauntings. He gave me a sidelong look, not quite amused, not quite dismissive. Folks say things. Welch has its share of ghost talk. You ask me, sometimes a place just remembers more than people do. You keep poking around, you might not like what remembers you back. I laughed, awkwardly, trying to hide the chill that crept over me. But he didn't laugh with me. He just went back to his toast. That afternoon, I tested it again. I walked through different streets, photographing random boarded-up houses. The rule held. Every third shot revealed the silhouette. Always the same tall, thin, head tilted. Sometimes the angle of light made it look male, other times female, but it was never more detailed than an outline. Always behind the glass of some forgotten building. By evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Not in the obvious way. There were no footsteps behind me. No shadows darting at the edge of sight, but in the way the town seemed to adjust around me. Windows darkened when I turned toward them. Reflections twitched in puddles as if they weren't mine. That night, in my room, I set the camera on a timer facing the inn's window. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a quirk of shutter. Timing. The sequence clicked off. When I checked the shots, my throat went dry. First frame, the empty street outside. Second frame, the same. Third frame, the silhouette now in the reflection of the glass, standing just behind me inside the room. I shut the laptop so hard, the sound echoed through the walls. I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on and the camera zipped up in its bag. But even then, I felt the pressure of eyes on me. At one point around 3 a.m., I heard a floorboard creak near the corner of the room. I whispered, "Hello?" into the empty air. Nothing answered, but the silence afterward felt heavier than before. I checked out the next morning. Bobby didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. As I drove out of Welch, the mist thickened, swallowing the town behind me. I didn't stop until I reached Charleston. Since then, I've tried using that camera again. Different states, different subjects. It doesn't matter. Every third exposure, no matter where I am, still contains the silhouette. It's no longer confined to Welch. Sometimes it's in a mirror behind me. Sometimes in the reflection of a car window. Once, in a hotel hallway, it appeared not as a reflection, but standing fully in the frame, closer than it had ever been. I've stopped taking photos. I don't even carry the camera anymore. But last week, while I was on a video call with a friend, the feed glitched for a second. Every third freeze frame on the playback showed it. Always the same figure, always watching. I don't know what happens when it finally appears outside of glass, and I'm not sure I want to. It was March 2nd, 2022, a Wednesday night that had started off with nothing more unusual than a stiff wind blowing out of the east and the low hiss of rain sliding over the back roads of Madison County. I remember the time clearly, 10:37 p.m., because I'd just turned the lock on the garage bay door and flicked off the fluorescence overhead when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from a customer, a man named Jenkins, who drove an old Ford Ranger, saying he wouldn't make it to pick up his truck until morning. That suited me fine. I wasn't looking for extra company that night. My shop sat right off Paint Lick Road, just outside Berea, Kentucky. A squat cinder block building painted a dull beige years ago and left to peel. With one roll-up bay door and a flickering neon sign that hadn't worked right in at least a decade. Folks in town had a nickname for me, the Brake Preacher. It started as a joke, because I'd gotten in the habit of scratching short prayers under the brake drums whenever I replaced them. Nothing elaborate, just little lines like "God keep them safe" or "deliver them home whole." I never advertised it. It was just something I'd started doing after a neighbor's boy died in a wreck years back. And it stuck. Most people never knew, unless they caught me doing it. And the ones who did mostly smiled and let it be, though a few liked to tell me it was superstitious nonsense. I didn't argue. It wasn't for them anyway. That night, the rain picked up harder, hitting the tin. Roof-like fingers drumming too fast. I locked up, killed the lights, and was halfway to my truck when I stopped cold. From inside the dark bay, something tapped. A single metallic knock, faint but sharp, like someone rapped on steel with a knuckle. I stood in the lot, rain soaking. Into my flannel, listening. Nothing. Just the hiss of rain on asphalt and the wind rushing through the power lines. I shook my head, chalking it up to cooling metal. The shop held heat during the day, and sometimes the drums and panels pinged. When they settled, but when I slid into my truck and turned the key, I froze again. There it was, clearer this time. Knock, knock, knock. Rhythmic, coming from inside the bay where Jenkins' Ranger sat up on the lift. Now, I've spent enough nights alone with groaning machinery to know how easy it is to spook yourself. Still, the sound had a pattern to it, like it was waiting on me. Against my better judgment, I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and went back inside. The bay smelled of wet concrete and machine oil. My boots squeaked against the damp floor. I swung the beam toward the lift, where the Ranger sat with its front end hanging open. The drums were fresh on both sides, clean metal, gleaming. I'd written the same prayer I always did on the underside. Lord, carry them safe. The knocking stopped as soon as I stepped closer. The silence pressed heavy, like the whole building was holding its breath. I leaned in, shined the light along the drum. Nothing, no loose bolts, no tools left behind. Just my own shaky reflection in the metal curve. Then, soft as a breath against glass, I heard it. A voice, not outside, not in the room, from inside the drum. Low and garbled like someone whispering through water. I jerked back so fast I smacked my shoulder against the lift. My flashlight skittered across the floor, beam spinning. I told myself I was imagining it. That I'd misheard the rain, the wind, anything else. But then it came again, clearer this time, drawn out in a rasp that made my stomach turn cold. Not safe. I bolted. Didn't bother shutting the bay door or picking up the light. I jumped in my truck and tore down Paint Lick Road, wipers barely keeping pace with the sheets of rain. I didn't stop until I hit the Dollar General parking lot in town, where the lights and pavement felt less like the edge of nowhere. I sat there, heart pounding, rain hammering the cab, trying to think it through. Metal resonates. Sound carries. Maybe the wind pushed through the lift in a way that made it sound like words. Maybe I was tired, hearing what I didn't want to by the time I got home. I'd convinced myself enough to sleep, though not well. I dreamt of brake drums rolling down empty highways, hollow voices echoing inside them. The next morning, I got to the shop before sunrise. Everything looked normal. My flashlight was still on the floor where I'd dropped it, battery dead. Jenkins showed up around 8 o'clock, cheerful, paid in cash, and drove off. I didn't say a word about the night before, but 2 days later, I heard the news. Jenkins had flipped his Ranger off a curve on Route 421. Witnesses said he never even hit the brakes. They found him dead at the scene. That's when I stopped writing prayers, Noli. Stopping didn't stop it. Weeks later, when I changed out a set of drums on a Camry, I ran a rag across the inside curve and there it was. My handwriting, my prayer. But I hadn't written it. I swear I hadn't. The letters were jagged, carved deeper than I'd ever scratched, like they'd been gouged from the inside out, and faint. Under the groan of cooling metal, I thought I heard the drum whisper again. Just 2 words this time. Not safe. I locked the shop and left. I don't know what I'll do when the next car comes in. Maybe close down for good. But if you're ever driving through Berea and you hear something knocking under your car, while it's in park, don't listen too closely, because I think something's knocking back. It was late September, the kind of evening when the air feels cooler than the day promised, and the sun sinks behind the hills with a suddenness that makes you realize how quickly summer has slipped away. I had taken my kayak out onto the Hiwassee River just before dusk, telling myself I'd paddle until the light dimmed and then head back to the launch. The river was calm, almost glassy, carrying the copper and violet reflections of the sky. It smelled faintly of wet leaves, sharp pine, and the mineral temps that rises off water when it's losing the day's warmth. I wasn't alone on the river, at least, not at first. A couple of fishermen had been set up on the bank upstream, their voices carrying across the water when I first pushed off. I remember thinking how sound traveled oddly there, like it warped across the current. By the time I drifted down into one of the wider bends, their voices were gone, and I was the only one around. The silence was soft, but not comforting. It was the kind of silence that makes you check behind you every so often. I had stopped paddling, and just let the kayak drift when I saw the first light. It was pale, almost white, glowing just under the surface of the river about 20 feet ahead. My first thought was that it was someone's dropped flashlight, or maybe a reflection from a house along the ridge. But there were no houses that too close, and the angle didn't make sense. The light bobbed once, like something buoyant had been disturbed from below. Then it faded, leaving only ripples on the water. I sat still, my paddle across my lap, waiting for it to reappear. The sky was dimming. Crickets had started their dry, rasping chorus in the trees, and I remember thinking I'd better not waste time chasing illusions. I gave one strong pull of the paddle to turn back toward the launch when the kayak lurched. It wasn't like hitting a rock or snagging a branch. This was a pull from underneath. Cold water spilled over the side, and I tilted too hard to correct. The river swallowed me fast. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 or 12 feet there, but cold enough to steal my breath. I kicked hard, trying to push the kayak back upright, but it had rolled completely. The current wasn't violent, just insistent, pulling me downriver as I surfaced and gasped. That's when I saw them again. Not one this time, but 3. The pale lights were drifting beneath me, their glow faint but steady, like lanterns moving in slow procession. They weren't just under the surface. They were deeper, maybe 4 or 5 feet down, but clear enough that I couldn't mistake them for reflections. And here's the part that still gnaws at me. With each bob of light, I heard it. A breath. Not Minai was thrashing, panting, coughing. Up water, these were slow, even inhalations, like someone sleeping. The sound carried up through the river, pressed against my ears in a way I felt more than heard. I tried to swim toward the overturned kayak, but it was drifting away and my arms felt heavy, uncooperative. My foot brushed something slick, soft, like algae, but solid beneath, and the lights moved closer. They rose in unison until they hovered just beneath the soles of my shoes. For a second, I thought maybe they were some trick of bioluminescence, but the breaths they got louder, pulling in and out in rhythm. "Help!" I shouted, though no one was near enough to hear. The river just carried my voice downstream, flat and useless. I forced myself to kick harder, thrashing until I broke free from whatever my foot had touched. The lights sank a little, circling, then floated up again as if following me. Each time they rose, another breath came, but the cadence had shifted faster now. Like someone waking up. I don't know how long it took me to reach the far bank, but I clawed my way onto the muddy edge, chest heaving, arms shaking. The kayak had drifted off, bumping lazily against a snag farther downstream. I lay there on the wet ground, too afraid to look back at the water, but I did. I had to. The river was calm again. No ripples, no glow. Just the steady, dark surface reflecting the last bruised purple of the sky. But I swear on everything, just before I pulled myself to my feet, I heard one last sound. A long exhale, low and wet, as if it had followed me up out of the water. I never retrieved that kayak. A buddy went back with me the next day, and we found it wedged against rocks, scraped but intact. He asked why I hadn't just held on to it when I tipped, and I couldn't explain without sounding insane. He laughed when I said I thought I saw lights. Told me it was swamp gas or reflections from passing cars on the highway, but I can still hear it when I lie awake some nights. That steady, dragging breath rising up from beneath me, like something old and patient in the river had been waiting. And for a few minutes, I had been close enough to disturb it. I haven't gone back out on the Hiwassee after dark. I tell people it was just a scare, that I had no business paddling alone at dusk. But that's not the reason. The reason is simple, and it keeps me out of any river once the light dies. I don't ever want to hear something breathing under me again. It was the spring of 2019, mid-April, one of those shoulder weeks in the Blue Ridge when the trees are leafing out in patch, some still skeletal and gray. Others already wearing that bright green fuzz that makes the mountains look almost soft. The air was cold enough that I had to pull on a beanie before unzipping the tent at dawn, but not cold enough to see my breath. We had camped just off the Blue Ridge Parkway, not at an official site, but in one of those gravel pull-offs where a faint trail led down into a hollow. It was me, my friend Aaron, and his girlfriend Lily. All three of us were amateur birders, and that weekend had been planned for months. The Appalachian spring migration is legendary, and we wanted to catch it. We set up the tent on Friday evening, the 19th, after a 3-hour drive. The sun was dropping behind the ridges and leaving strips of red-gold light across the tops of the trees. The hollow itself was darker, cool and damp, with a small creek threading its way through slick rocks at the bottom. The smell of wet leaves and earth was everywhere, stronger than the faint smoke of the little camp stove we used to make ramen. That night felt completely normal. We ate, we drank a couple of cheap beers, and listened to the sounds of whip-poor-wills echoing across the dark. It was around 11 when we turned in. The first morning, Saturday, started beautifully. At exactly 6:12 a.m., the hollow erupted in what birders call the dawn chorus. If you've never heard it in the Appalachians, it's a kind of natural symphony. Wood thrushes, ovenbirds, towhees, tanagers all, layering calls until the whole forest seems to ring with life. I unzipped the tent and just sat there, shivering with my binoculars around my neck, writing down species as quickly as I could. Aaron called out IDs from memory. Lily laughed when I mistook a scarlet tanager for a cardinal. By 6:45, the chorus was tapering down, the sun clearing the eastern ridge. We made coffee and spent the day hiking side trails, ticking off warblers, snapping photos, and talking about nothing heavier than which diner we'd hit on the drive back. That night, the hollow felt different. I noticed it when I walked away from the fire to take a piss near the tree line. There was no wind, but I heard what I thought was a sigh in the canopy overhead. Not a single gust, just one long breath that shifted the leaves, then silence again. When I came back, Aaron asked if I'd seen anything weird, because he swore he'd heard something moving along the creek bed. We brushed it off. Animals are everywhere out here. Still, I felt like the darkness was thicker than before, as if the hollow had pulled a curtain down around us. The real strangeness started the next morning. I woke at 6:09, checked my phone, and braced myself for the dawn chorus. Right on schedule, at 6:12, the forest burst alive again. This one seemed louder than the day before. Lily muttered something about how amazing it was that nature could be so precise. We listened, logged a few more species, and watched the sun edge over the ridge. It all faded again around 6:45. Nothing strange yet, but at 7:15, while I was rinsing the coffee pot in the creek, it happened again. A second dawn chorus, just as loud, just as layered, as if someone had pressed rewind and hit play again on the same recording. At first I laughed, called back up the slope. Hey, guess the birds overslept. But when Aaron and Lily came down, their faces weren't smiling. They both heard it too, and it wasn't just a few birds, it was the whole forest, screaming awake for a second sunrise. The problem was the sun was already above the ridge. The light didn't match the sound. Birds sang like it was the break of day, but the world looked mid-morning. We argued about it. Lily said maybe the hollow's microclimate was confusing them, like some kind of echo chamber of temperature and light. Aaron muttered something about magnetic anomalies, how birds navigate by the Earth's field. I wanted to believe either explanation. But when the chorus ended 30 minutes later, exactly the same duration as the first, I felt a cold spot in my gut. That had nothing to do with the chilly water on my hands. That night, none of us slept well. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear faint birdsong drifting where it shouldn't have been, like scraps of dawn leaking into midnight. Around 2 a.m., Lily sat bolt upright and hissed. Did you hear that? We held our breath. From the ridge above came a rolling chorus, faint but unmistakable warblers, thrushes, sparrows singing like the sun was rising. Though my watch said 2:04 a.m., the sound faded in seconds, leaving the kind of silence that hurts your ears. Sunday morning, we woke early, all three of us, tense and silent. At 6:12, the first dawn chorus started again, right on schedule. We didn't even write down species this time. We just sat there, staring into the trees. 30 minutes later, it faded. Then at 7:15, the second chorus began, every bird in the hollow acting as though dawn had come again. Aaron swore under his breath. Lily started crying quietly into her jacket sleeve. I suggested we pack up and leave, but Aaron shook his head. He wanted to stay, to record it, prove we weren't losing our minds. He set his phone on a tripod by the creek, recording audio. I stayed back, chewing the inside of my cheek, raw. The second chorus ended. The forest went still. We waited at 7:45. When I thought the worst had passed, a new sound rose up. It was like the dawn chorus but warped, slowed, the notes dragging into one another. It was as if the forest was trying to sing but had forgotten how. The warbler's trill stretched into a metallic groan. The thrush's flute-like whistle became a flat, human-like wail. The sound grew louder and louder until it felt like the air itself was vibrating in my chest. Aaron bolted to grab his phone, but the sound cut off instantly, as though a switch had been thrown. The hollow was silent. Utterly, impossibly silent. Not a bird, not a bug, not even the creek seemed to make noise. That was when I noticed the light. It wasn't just brighter. It was wrong. The sun looked higher in the sky than it should have been for 7:45. The shadows of the trees stretched in two directions, one pointing west, the other east, as though two suns were casting them. I don't remember packing. I don't remember hiking back to the car. My last clear memory is glancing back at the hollow and seeing a strange shimmer hanging in the air, like heat rising off asphalt. Only it wasn't hot. Felt cold, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache. We drove back down the parkway. In silence. Aaron deleted the recording before we even hit Asheville. He said the file was corrupted anyway, full of static and distorted voices. He didn't want it on his phone. Lily hasn't spoken to me since that weekend. I tell myself it was some natural phenomenon we didn't understand. That's the only way I can function. But sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and hear it again, the birds singing there. Dawn chorus, 30 minutes off schedule. And when I check the clock, it's never the right time. Last week, I swear I heard two choruses outside my window in town. One at 6:12, the other at 6:42. Both perfect, both wrong. I don't camp anymore. On June 4, 2018, I was sent to Duffield, Virginia to inspect the Needle Eye Tunnel. It was an assignment that should have taken me half a day at most routine walkthrough. Check for structural integrity, water seepage, or anything that might compromise the rails. I'd done dozens of tunnels for CSX, and this one wasn't supposed to be any different. The forecast said partly cloudy with highs in the low 80s. But in the valley, the air always carried that heavy, mossy coolness that clung to your clothes. I remember the smell of wet leaves baking under the sun as I parked my truck near the overgrown service road that wound down to the tunnel mouth. Duffield isn't a bustling town. It's all ridges and hollows, a place where railroad cuts slice through mountains like scars. The Needle Eye Tunnel sits just beyond a stretch of kudzu-choked track. The portal is framed in blackened stone, blocks the size of coffins mortared together more than a century ago. I'd read that it was bored by hand in the 1890s, standing. Before it, I felt the same thing I always felt around old tunnels, like you're looking into a throat. Dark and unwelcoming, waiting to swallow you whole. I slung my gear bag over my shoulder, checked my flashlight, and stepped into the mouth. The temperature dropped instantly, the air damp with that metallic temps of iron and limestone. My boots crunched on gravel scattered between the ties. Light from outside stretched in behind me, long and thin, until it gave way to pure blackness. My flashlight beam caught the curved ceiling, brickwork still intact, dripping with water that plinked onto my hardette. At first, it was business as usual. I ran my hands along the walls, checked for bulges or cracks, listened for the hollow thump of loose stone. A train hadn't come through in over an hour, and dispatch had cleared the line for me. I moved deeper, the silence pressing in, broken only by the scurry of some rodent echoing farther ahead. That's when I noticed the rails. The main line ran true, as it should, to steel tracks stretching into the dark. But about 50 yards in, I spotted something odd. Another set of rails, thinner, lay just inside the first. They hugged the gauge like a mirror version, but they weren't modern steel. My flashlight revealed them to be rusted, the color of dried blood, except this is what stopped meat. They weren't covered in grime or dust like the rest of the tunnel. They were perfectly clean. Not polished, not new, but bare. As though something or someone was still running across them. I crouched and ran my glove over the metal. Smooth, cold. My fingers came away dry. Not a fleck of rust rubbed off. I frowned and radioed back to dispatch. "Hey, you got any record of a dual gauge through needle eye?" Static, then a bored voice. "Negative. Standard gauge only." "Why?" I stared at the twin rails shimmering faintly in the beam. No reason. Thought I saw something. I didn't mention them again. The farther I walked, the stronger that uneasy pressure grew in my chest, like the tunnel was shrinking around me. The walls sweated moisture, rivulets trickling down to join shallow puddles between the ties. My light caught faint graffiti names, dates, crude drawings, but some were old enough to have faded into nothing but scratches. Every so often, I'd catch the stink of sulfur, faint but unmistakable, carried on a breath of air that seemed to come from nowhere. Halfway through, I stopped to mark measurements on a clipboard. I heard a sound behind me. It wasn't loud, it's just a shuffle, like gravel shifting under a boot. I swung my light back toward the portal. Empty. The circle of daylight was still there, a distant coin of pale sky. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was water dripping or a rat dislodging stones. But when I turned forward again, I froze. The clean rails were gone. Not gone, exactly. They had shifted. They ran beside me now, pressed so close to the main line I could have stepped from one set to the other, and they gleamed brighter, as though my flashlight wasn't even needed to reveal them. I stood there for a long minute, trying to make sense of it. I even knelt down again, touched the rail to prove it was really there. It was cold, humming faintly like far-off machinery. My radio crackled then, startling me so bad I nearly dropped it. "Dispatch again. Just checking you're still breathing in there, Mike." I swallowed hard before answering. "Yeah, still breathing." My voice didn't sound like mine. When I stood and looked forward again, my beam caught something new. A shape. At first, I thought it was a man, standing where the tunnel bent slightly left. A worker, maybe. Someone I hadn't been told about. But the longer I stared, the less human it looked. Too tall, too thin, its shoulders narrowing wrong. Like the silhouette of something stretched. And though I kept my light steady, the beam seemed to slide off its face, refusing to illuminate it. I called out, "Hello, you're in a restricted tunnel. You need to clear out now." The echo came back distorted, repeating me in a voice that wasn't mine. "Hello, clear out now, clear out now." And then it stepped backward, melting into the dark where the rails converged. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. My notes after that are scattered, handwriting uneven. I think I walked faster, almost jogged, telling myself to finish the inspection and get out. But the tunnel seemed longer than it should have been, stretching on, the daylight behind me shrinking smaller and smaller. At one point, I swear I heard a whistle, not modern, not the blare of a diesel horn. This was high-pitched, shrill, the kind of steam whistle you only hear in museums now. It rose and fell in the distance, and with it came a vibration through the floor. Subtle but real. I could feel it in the soles of my boots, rattling the gravel. But no train came, only the sound, the trembling, and the ghost set of rails glowing faintly beside me. When I finally staggered out into daylight, sweat cold under my shirt. The rails ended abruptly at the tunnel mouth, vanishing into dirt. Just as if they'd never existed. I didn't file them in my report. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of being pulled off duty or laughed out of the office. Maybe I already knew what I'd seen wasn't something anyone could explain on paper. But I can't stop thinking about them. Perfectly rusted. Perfectly clean. Always waiting just inside the dark. Last month, A new hire asked me about Needle Eye. He said he'd heard stories about extra tracks, about a man-shaped shadow that repeats your words back to you. He asked me if it was true. I told him not to linger in the tunnel. Don't stop, don't listen, and above all, don't step onto the second set of rails, because I don't know where they go. But I have a feeling they don't bring you back. It was March 14, 2022, the first warm day after a dragging Tennessee winter. I remember because the sun had finally burned through 3 straight weeks of gray drizzle. And Carter County smelled like thawed earth and cedar. I was 2 months into a contract with the State Historical Society, cataloging sites connected to the Civil War saltpeter mining industry. My assignment that week was to document old caves around the Watauga River Valley, where locals once harvested nitrate for gunpowder. The work was tedious hours of hiking, scribbling notes, and photographing hollowed rock. But that day I found something that has been eating me alive ever since. Something I wish I had never touched. Saltpeter Cave sits low in a bluff just off Mill Creek Road, not far from Elizabethton. To the casual hiker, it looks like nothing more than a black mouth and limestone, fringed by moss and wild ivy. Inside, it stretches back about 200 feet before narrowing into low crawlways. I had been told to check for any remnants of mining timbers, carved troughs, that sort of thing. When I ducked inside that morning, the air was cool and damp, about 55 degrees. My headlamp picked out dripping calcite and faint scrawl marks on the walls where lantern soot still lingered. It felt like every other cave I had been inside, until I reached the back chamber. The floor was muddy and uneven, but against the far wall, half buried in silt, was a wooden chest. It was small, no bigger than a footlocker, with rusted iron straps and a warped lid. At first, I assumed it was a leftover dynamite box or a storage chest miners had abandoned. When I pried it open with my multi-tool, I found exactly one item inside, a ledger book wrapped in stiff leather and bound with a cracked brass clasp. The leather was brittle, but it hadn't rotted. The pages inside were yellow but intact, and the moment I touched them, a puff of cave dust and old mold hit me in the face. I gagged, but curiosity overruled disgust. I slipped on my nitrile gloves and opened it. The ledger was dated at the top. Saltpeter Works. January 3rd, 1863. At first, it looked routine. Just columns of numbers, weights of nitrate, labor, tallies, names of workers. But about 10 pages in, the entry stopped looking like accounting and became stranger. Instead of names like Robertson or Hensley, I saw my own surname written in neat, spidery ink. Whitfield. That froze me. My family never lived in this county. I'm from Knoxville. I flipped forward. The dates in the margins began leaping, skipping decades. 1907, 1939, 1974. I thought maybe it had been reused by different owners over time, till I reached a page near the middle where the date was written. Plainly, April 21st, 2022. That was a month in the future. And beneath it, in looping script, was an entry written in handwriting identical to mine. Not just similar, identical. Down to the slant of my capital W's and the way I crossed my T's. It said, Saltpeter Cave, ledger retrieved, returned. At dusk, I felt my stomach knot. I had never seen this book before. Yet here was my handwriting predicting what I had just done. Except it hadn't happened yet. Or had it? I remember closing the book with a snap and just sitting there on the damp cave floor, my breath echoing in the chamber. I told myself it had to be some kind of elaborate historical hoax. Maybe a prank. Maybe another Whitfield had come through. In the 70s, someone whose handwriting by coincidence matched mine. But as I flipped further, the entries jumped beyond 2022, 2025, 2031, even 2048. Some were mundane, listing weather or dates, but some were horrifying. One in 2025, rain for weeks. Roads washed out, remain below ground. Another in 2031, collapse at entrance. 3 trapped, 1 survives. And then, scrawled in shaky script under 2048. Last entry. I cannot leave. They are waiting. I shut the ledger hard enough to stir dust. My first instinct was to stuff it back in the chest and bury it again, but the historian in me couldn't let go. I took photographs. I packed it into my rucksack. But the whole hike back to the truck, I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like the woods were quieter than they should have been, like the sound of the creek was muted. By the time I reached the gravel lot, I was sweating despite the cool air. That night, at the motel in Elizabethton, I laid the book on the desk and stared at it for an hour before daring to open it again. When I did, the ink looked darker than before, almost wet. I paged through, looking for the April 21st, 2022 entry. Except now, beneath it, there was another line. My name, first and last. Ledger must be returned, or else. Again, in my exact hand. I swear on my life that line hadn't been there when I first read it in the cave. The next day, I drove to the State Archive office in Johnson City, tending to hand it over, wash my hands of it. But when I arrived, the building was locked. Handwritten sign taped to the door read closed for maintenance. I sat there in my car for 20 minutes, the ledger on the passenger seat, before finally driving away. I told myself I'd come back the following week. But every time I tried after that, something stopped me. A storm, a schedule conflict. Or worse, waking up with the inexplicable certainty that I shouldn't, that the ledger wasn't supposed to leave the county on April 21st, the date written in the book. I couldn't sleep. I left the motel at dusk and drove back to Mill Creek Road, almost in a trance. The sky was slate gray, wind pushing through the trees. I carried the ledger under my arm, flashlight in my teeth. When I crouched into the cave, the air felt thicker, colder than before. My beam caught the empty chest at the back, exactly where I'd found it. I don't even remember making the decision. I just knew I had to put the ledger back. My hands shook as I slid it inside and closed the lid. The moment I did, I heard something. A scuff of stone on stone, deeper in the cave. Not an animal, not water. Footsteps. I spun my light into the crawlways, but nothing moved. The sound stopped. Then, from behind me, clear as day, a man's voice whispered my full name. Not shouted, whispered. My own voice. I dropped the flashlight. In the strobe of its rolling beam, I swear I saw a figure just at the edge of the chamber, hunched, watching. Its outline looked wrong, like my shoulders in height, but crooked, doubled. I ran. I don't even remember getting out, just bursting into the night air with mud on my jeans and blood on my palms from scraping the rock. When I reached the truck, I locked the doors and stayed there until sunrise. That was over a year ago. I haven't told the Historical Society. I wrote my report as if the cave contained nothing but abandoned timbers. But sometimes, when I wake up at night, I hear scratching at the door. Sometimes, my phone alarm goes off at times I never set, with reminders titled, Return at Dusk. And last month, while sorting through old family papers at my parents' house, I found a yellowed page tucked into a genealogy folder. It was torn from a ledger. The date at the top read July 18, 2025. My name was written beneath. In my own hand, still here, still writing. I don't know if this post will matter. I don't know if sharing it will make anything worse. But if anyone reading this lives near Carter County and finds themselves tempted to explore Saltpeter Cave, I'm begging you, open the chest. Don't touch the ledger. If it already knows your name, it's too late. It was November 12, 2018. The first winter storm of the year had blown down from the north and iced over Gallia County. I remember the date because I had just come back from a 3-day safety refresher class, and I was itching to prove to the foreman that I hadn't forgotten how to work a line. The wind had scoured the ridges all night, trees popping like gunshots as limbs snapped under the weight of frozen rain. By morning, the ground was glazed in brittle white, and everything, the fields, the barns, the sagging telephone lines, looked like they'd been dipped in glass. We got the call around 5:30 a.m. A stretch of the Gallia line running east of Centenary was down. Some farmer had called it in after seeing sparks in the fog at the edge of his property. I drove my old F-150 down Route 141. The heater struggling to keep up with the cold seeping in through the floorboards. The sun was barely up, just a smear of dull orange bleeding through the overcast sky, and fog hung thick in the hollows, curling low over the corn stubble like smoke from a dying fire. I pulled up at the staging point where my buddy Clay was already parked. He leaned against the hood of the utility truck, blowing steam into his hands. "Hell of a morning," he said. "Hell of a week," I answered. We loaded up our gear and drove the truck down the service road, tires crunching over the crust of ice. The line sagged across the field ahead of us, dark and dead, its weight dragging it into a shallow U most of the time. A downed line is just that, dead. But you still treat it like it's ready to kill you. I'd seen enough accidents to know one wrong assumption could end you in a heartbeat. The farmer, a gray-bearded man in coveralls, came trudging up behind us through the frost. He pointed with his gloved hand. "She's been sparking all night, like it's alive. Thought I saw it moving." Clay nodded politely, though I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Farmers and homeowners always thought they saw sparks, lights, or movement. 9 times out of 10, it was nothing. But as we approached, I realized the farmer wasn't entirely wrong. The fog was thicker along the sagging wire. Every so often, the mist seemed to swirl unnaturally, as if nudged by some invisible finger. The line itself hung heavy, creaking as it shifted against the pole hardware. And then I saw it. The vapor stirred along the curve of the dead wire. Not random, but deliberate, like someone dragging a fingertip across a fogged bathroom mirror. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but Clay muttered under his breath, "You see that?" I swallowed. Yeah, the movement spelled something, 3 crude strokes that resembled an L. Then 2, more like an O, before either of us could say a word. The fog smoothed itself out, erasing the letters as if they'd never been there. Clay shook his head and laughed nervously. "Trick of the light. Cold air messes with your eyes." "Sure," I said, though I didn't believe it. We rigged the line, hooked it, and set about restringing it to take the slack. I tried to focus on my gloves, on the steel bite of the hardware, but I couldn't shake the sensation that the air around me was thick with breath. Each time I glanced up, the fog seemed to huddle closer, pressing in against us. Half an hour later, when we'd nearly finished, the wire sagged again. Only this time, neither of us had touched it. The tension meter was steady, no wind to speak of, yet the line dipped lower and lower, groaning under an invisible weight. And then the letters came back. This time, clear as day. LOOK. Clay froze. One boot half on the ladder rung. "What the hell is that?" I could only stare. The letters held for several seconds before unraveling back into shapeless mist. The farmer, who'd been smoking a cigarette near his barn, called out, "You boys all right?" "Fine," Clay shouted back, though his voice cracked. We finished the job in silence, both of us pretending not to see the way the fog coiled around the wire, writing and erasing words like it had a mind of its own. By the time we packed up, my nerves were shot. That night, lying in bed, I convinced myself it had been a trick-wind ice fatigue. But 2 days later, I was back on that same stretch of line after another complaint. This time, I was alone. The fog was thicker, denser, almost oily. As I walked beneath the sagging cable, it dropped again, letters scrawling in the mist directly above me. LISTEN. And in that instant, I swear I heard it. Not the groan of metal or the whisper of wind, but a voice. Thin, stretched like it. Had been carried from miles away on the wire. A voice saying my name. I bolted for the truck and didn't stop until I was miles down the road. My hands shaking too bad to grip the wheel steady. I never told the foreman what I really saw. Clay and I agreed to keep quiet because who would believe it? But I stopped volunteering for storm calls after that. Every time the fog rolls in over Gallia County, I can't shake the memory of those letters forming in the air like someone writing on glass with their breath. The worst part? 2 weeks later, Clay didn't show up for shift. They found his truck parked on a service road near that same line. The door was wide open, engine still running, cab empty. No footprints in the frost. Just a fresh coil of fog tangled in the dead wire, swaying like it was waiting for someone else to read what it had to say. And every time I drive past there, even in daylight, I swear I see the line dip and shudder, like something unseen is hanging off it. Spelling out messages meant for whoever dares to stop. I don't stop anymore. But sometimes, when the night is damp and my windows fog over, I catch words scrawled across the glass from the inside. The last one wasn't look or listen. It was follow. It was the summer of 2019, late July, when the storms rolled through Washington County. I was living in Jonesboro, the oldest town in Tennessee, where the streets carry their own kind of weight, like they've been watching people for too long. That night, the lightning came down in hard sheets, the kind that rattles your bones and makes the old houses groan like they're alive. Around 11 p.m., a strike hit the old Methodist church on Main Street. Folks said it was the tallest structure in town, practically begging for it. The tower didn't catch fire, but the bells, 3 heavy bronze bells that had hung up there for over a century, were struck directly. Afterward, everyone said the same thing. The clappers had been blown out, gone, melted, or hurled somewhere into the dark. And yet, starting the very next night, the bells began to ring. I lived just 2 streets over, close enough to hear them. The sound wasn't right. Bells usually roll across the air, spreading wide, fading out in waves. But these tones moved like a blade through water. People started noticing that the sound didn't wash over town the way it should. It traveled in a line, cutting through 5 houses in a perfect row, then stopped cold before it reached the 6th. If you lived inside that path, you heard it clearly. If you didn't, you wouldn't hear a thing. I know this because my house was 4th in that line. My neighbor Carl, 1 house down, swore he'd sit on his porch at midnight and never hear a single peal, while my walls shook with it. The first night it happened, I was in bed, window cracked open for the breeze. The rain had left the air heavy, metallic. At exactly 12:07 a.m., the sound came. Not a gradual swell, but sudden, like someone had dropped a stone into a bucket right beside my head. My heart jumped into my throat. The tone was deep, resonant, but wrong, like it was coming from inside the walls instead of outside in the night. My dog, Maggie, bolted upright at the foot of the bed and let out a low growl that I'd never heard from her before. I told myself it was in my head. Maybe a transformer, humming weird after the lightning. But when I went out the next day, half the town was buzzing about it. The damn bells, people muttered. Some laughed it off, but others looked pale, like they hadn't slept. An old woman at the grocery store told me her grandmother used to say those bells were cursed, that they were forged from melted Confederate cannons and never should have been hung in a church. I shrugged it off, but when the sound came again the following night, right on time, my skin prickled with something I couldn't shake. For the first week, the bells rang every night at 12:07. Always the same straight line of houses, always skipping. The sixth. People in town started mapping it out, choosing string, chalk on sidewalks, even pins on a map at the diner. The line cut through Main, curved across Depot Street, passed through my block, and then ended. That ending was the part no one could explain. Sound doesn't just stop. But if you stood in Carl's driveway, you'd hear nothing while the air behind you still med. By the second week, things began to change inside the houses along that line. Small things at first. In mine, the pictures on the wall tilted just slightly after each ringing, like someone had walked by and brushed them. At the Andersons' place down the street, their kitchen clock stopped at exactly 12:07 every night, ticking again only after dawn. Carl's daughter, before the sound line stopped at their house, said she saw shadows move across her ceiling when the bells tolled. Shadows that didn't belong to anyone standing in the room. I told myself not to feed into the hysteria. People in small towns love stories, and a storm-damaged church bell was as good a start as any. But then one night, I made the mistake of opening my front door as the ringing began. I thought I'd catch the sound in the open air, prove to myself it was just acoustics. Instead, it felt like the tone shoved straight through me, vibrating in my ribs. The street was empty, perfectly still, yet my dog barked at something I couldn't see. And for the first time, I thought I saw a movement too. At the far end of the block, right where the sound stopped, a figure flickered in the shadows like the shape of someone standing still, but gone before I could blink twice. By my dog-est, no one was laughing anymore. The fifth house in the Line old white bungalow that had sat empty for years was suddenly alive with noise. People swore they heard voices coming from inside at night, though the place had no electricity. Someone claimed they saw lights moving from room to room, like lanterns. The police checked it out twice, found nothing, but I noticed they didn't linger past midnight. The breaking point came when the Johnsons, who lived in the second house on the line, left town altogether. They didn't sell their place or pack up much, they just left. A neighbor said Mrs. Johnson had woken to find her son standing at the foot of her bed at 12:07, eyes wide, whispering, "They want us in the sixth house." Over and over, they were gone by morning. That sixth house. I can still see it if I close my eyes. Narrow brick place at the very end of Maple Street. The line of sound should have passed through it, but it didn't. Everyone noticed that. It just stopped in the driveway. The windows were always dark, though people swore they saw someone inside sometimes, watching. No one had lived there for decades. The story was that the last family left after a fire in the back parlor. Others said the fire never happened at all, that the family just vanished one night. No one knew for sure. But after the bell started, everyone in town started looking at that house differently. Like the sound wasn't skipping it by accident, like it was being held back. The last night I stayed in Jonesboro before I left for good, the bells rang louder than ever. It was late August, thick air, no wind, stars sharp in the sky. When the tone struck at 12:07, the glass in my windows shivered. Maggie barked until she made herself hoarse. I thought about the Johnson boys' words, about the sixth house, and for some reason I walked outside. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe that shadow again, maybe nothing at all, but what I saw was worse. Every window in the 5 houses lit up at once, like fire catching from one to the next. I could see silhouettes moving behind the glass, dozens of them, none belonging to the families that lived there. And at the very end of the line, the 6th house stood dark. But I swear on my life, the front door was wide open. Waiting, I left town the next morning, packed what I could, loaded Maggie in the car, and didn't look back. I haven't been to Jonesboro since. I hear the church tower still stands, hollow and useless. People say the bells haven't rung in a couple of years. But others claim they still do. You just have to be standing in the right place on the right street. At 12:07, and if you are, the sound will find you, cut through you, and carry you. Down the line, straight toward the house where it stops. I don't know what's in there, and I don't want to, but I think about it more often than I'd like. Because sometimes, even now, hundreds of miles away, I wake at exactly 12:07, and in the silence of my own house, I can almost feel the walls humming. It was late October when I first drove up Parsons Ridge Road. The leaves had already turned. A heavy quilt of orange and brown scattered across the gravel shoulder. I remember the sky that day being pale, almost bleached, with a sharp wind that made the branches clack together like brittle bones. I had an appointment to show a small farmhouse to a young couple from Charlotte. The property had been sitting vacant for months, and the owners were eager to sell. On paper, it looked appealing: 3 bedrooms, good acreage, old but well-maintained. But the place carried a kind of reputation around the county, the kind of thing that doesn't get written into listings, but lingers in whispers. I parked out front, buttoned my jacket, and checked my watch. It was just after 3 in the afternoon, the kind of daylight where you'd expect a house to look its friendliest. The farmhouse itself was plain white siding, a slanted porch, shutters faded from navy to near gray. The for sale sign leaned a little in the yard. When I walked up the steps, the boards groaned beneath my shoes in a way that felt too loud for the empty fields stretching behind me. Inside, the air was still and heavy, that smell of wood and dust you get in houses that haven't been lived in for a while. I went through my usual routine, checking the lights, making sure the doors weren't swollen shut, windows able to open. Everything seemed fine. It was only when I climbed the narrow staircase and opened the door to the back bedroom that I noticed the first thing that didn't make sense. The air hit me like I'd walked into a meat locker. I stepped back instinctively, confused, then pushed forward again to be sure. My phone said it was 58 degrees outside. The other rooms of the house felt about the same. But here, in this bedroom at the rear of the house, my breath came out in pale plumes. I stood there, hugging myself, shivering. Though the radiator beneath the window was lukewarm and the vent near the closet whispered with heat, I pulled out my phone and opened the temperature app. 41 degrees. Always 41, every time I checked. I thought it was a faulty sensor until I could see the faint frost feathering along the edges of the single window pane. I closed the door and moved on. By the time the couple arrived, I'd convinced myself it was some quirk of insulation. Maybe a draft pulling from somewhere in the wall. I didn't mention it. We toured the downstairs, the kitchen, the wide yard out back. They were smiling, nodding, already imagining themselves there. Then the wife asked to see the bedrooms. My chest tightened. I led them upstairs, showing the first 2 without hesitation. But when we came to the cold room, I froze outside the door. This one's, well, it needs some updating, I said, opening it. The wife stepped in first, then recoiled almost immediately. It's freezing in here, she said, rubbing her arms. The husband frowned and pulled out his own phone, checking the temperature. It says 41, he muttered, sounding more irritated than afraid. He knelt to check the radiator, opened the closet, even banged on the wall. But nothing explained it. When he moved to the window, that's when I noticed what made my stomach sink. Outside the window, the yard should have stretched down into the slope. Trees stripped bare against the October sky. But what we saw through the glass wasn't the same as what I'd seen when I pulled up. The trees outside were heavy with snow, their branches bent low, glittering in pale light. A thin crust of ice filmed over the ground. It wasn't just cold. It was winter, deep and absolute, though the rest of the house and world were still in autumn. The couple stared, silent, until the wife whispered, "It looks like last year's storm." Her words felt strange, but as she said them, I realized she was right. I remembered that Storm It had knocked out power across the county, buried roads for a week. That was last February, yet there it was, framed in the glass like a photograph that moved just slightly when the wind shifted. I tried to explain it away. Old glass can distort. Maybe it was catching a reflection, something about the angle. But the frost lining the inside corners didn't care about my excuses. The husband shook his head. "That's not normal," he said flatly, pulling his wife toward the hall. They didn't finish the tour. I closed the door to that room and left it shut, like you might close a lid over something you weren't ready to look at again. Weeks passed. The house lingered unsold. No surprise. I stopped mentioning the third bedroom and showings, steering people instead toward the first two, hoping no one pressed the issue. But word got around. The cold room became part of the local chatter. Again, same as it had been years before when the last family abruptly moved out. Some said it was bad insulation, others claimed it was worse. I tried to stay professional, but I caught myself avoiding that house on my drives, not wanting to see it slouched against the ridge like it was waiting for me. Then, just before Christmas, a man named Jeff Harper called. He was relocating for work, needed something quick, didn't care about quirks or history. We signed papers faster than usual. I handed him the keys the week before New Year's, snow just starting to dust the ridge. He was cheerful, practical. The type who laughed off small-town rumors. "Every house has a cold spot," he said, shrugging. "I'll just keep the door shut." I didn't hear from him again until February. I was in the office late when the phone rang. His voice was different, quieter, strained. "You knew about the room," he said. I didn't answer. "The window," he continued. "It's not just last winter anymore. It changes. I saw my driveway in snow, then bare, then snow again. Sometimes it's night in the glass when it's still day behind me, and sometimes," his voice broke, "sometimes I see myself, not moving right, not standing right." Static filled the line, then silence. I called back but got no answer. By the weekend, deputies were at the ridge. Neighbors reported no lights on for days. They found the farmhouse empty, door unlocked, car in the drive. Inside, everything looked in place, but upstairs, in the cold room, the temperature was exactly 41 degrees. On the floor beneath the window, a thin crust of ice had spread in the shape of two bare footprints. Toes pressed against the pane. I haven't shown a property on Parsons Ridge since. Some houses don't want to be sold. Some rooms aren't meant to be lived in. And every so often, when the weather turns, I think about calling Jeff's number again, just to see if anyone answers.